Hello everyone, welcome to the new audiobook. If you find it enjoyable, please give me a like and subscribe. Now, let's dive into the story.
Biological parent who might never arrive. Well, it's off to work for me, Ellie said. Bye, Alice. Alice hugged Ellie. Bye, Lily. Ellie hugged her back. Cal said it's a half day today at the girls' school. He'll bring Sarah by for a while after lunch. Tell him thanks. Maybe Alice will talk to Sarah this time. She nuzzled Alice's neck. Right, little girl? Alice's answer was a high-pitched giggle. Ellie left the house and went out to her cruiser. With a quick honk, Alice loved that noise, she was off. In the weeks since Christmas and New Year's, Rain Valley had settled back into its usual midwinter routine. More often than not, the downtown streets were empty of both cars and people. The taverns filled up earlier and stayed busy longer. Ellie and Earl and Mel took turns waiting just off the highway for drivers who thought it was okay to pound beers and then operate a vehicle. Weekend matinees at the theater were jammed to the rafters with kids, and it was impossible to get a lane or a parking stall at the bowling alley. News of the flying wolf girl had all but faded from the newspapers. Even Mort had better things to write about these days, like the rumblings at Mount St. Helens and the court-sanctioned Macaw tribe whale hunt. Days at the station slid back into their comforting routine. Calm had returned to Rain Valley, and those who were charged with keeping that peace were glad. Cal had more time again to read his comics and draw his drawings, since the phone rarely rang. Peanut scheduled everyone according to their family needs and paid their paychecks on time. In short, life was good. Now, Ellie drove through the Ancient Grounds coffee stand, got a grande mocha latte, then continued on to the station. She pulled into her parking stall behind the station and went in the back door. She was in the lunchroom, checking out what was in the fridge, when Peanut bustled into the room and slammed the door shut behind her. "Ellen!" she said in the stage whisper she reserved for big gossip. Ellie took a sip of her coffee and glanced at the clock. 11:30 was pretty early for big news. "Let me guess. The wrong person was voted off Survivor." Peanut smacked her. "Survivor's over." Ellie shut the fridge. "Okay, what's the skinny, big girl?" "It's important that you keep your wits about you. Cal and I are worried." "That I'm witless? How comforting." "You know how stupid you get around certain men." "I'm not admitting that. However, the only good-looking man in town is hot for my sister." "Not anymore." "Max isn't into jewels anymore?" Peanut hit her in the shoulder. "Pay attention." Ellie frowned. "What in the hell are you babbling about?" "There's a guy waiting for you out front." "So? Why the full panic?" "He's gorgeous, and he won't talk to anyone but you." "No kidding." "You should see the way you're smiling. This is exactly what I was afraid of." Ellie eased out of the lunchroom and peered down the hallway. From here, all she could see was a man, with his back to her, sitting in the chair opposite her desk. He was dressed all in black. "Who is it?" "He wouldn't give his name. Won't take off his sunglasses either." She snorted. "Must be from California." Ellie ducked back into the lunchroom and grabbed her purse. 5 minutes in the bathroom and she'd touched up her makeup and brushed her teeth. Back in the lunchroom, she turned to Peanut. "How do I look?" "This is so not good. You're going to go into full slut mode now." "Bite me. I haven't had a date in months." Ellie smoothed the wrinkles from her uniform, adjusted the 3 gold stars on her collar, and walked out into the main room of the station house. Peanut hurried along behind her. Cal looked up at her approach. He immediately noticed her makeup, then glanced at the man across from him and shook his head. "Big surprise," he muttered. She kept moving. "Hello, I'm Chief Barton," she said, rounding her desk. I understand. He turned to her. Ellie forgot what she'd been about to say. All she saw were chiseled cheekbones, full lips, and a mass of unruly black hair. He took off his sunglasses and revealed a pair of electric blue eyes. Holy Mother of God, she thought. Ellie sat down without shaking his hand. I've come a long way to see you, he said in a worn, gravelly voice. An accent, just a hint of one, but enough. She couldn't place it. Australian, maybe, or Cajun. She loved a man with an accent. I'm Georges Azel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which he set on her desk. The name registered. I see you remember me. He leaned forward, pushing the paper closer to her. Don't worry about the way you're looking at me. I've grown used to it. I'm here about her. Her? He unfolded the paper he'd pushed forward. It was a picture of Alice. I'm her father. Alice, how many times are we going to have this same discussion? Julia couldn't help laughing at her own comment. She and Alice did many things together these days. None of them could accurately be characterized as a discussion. Put your shoes on. No. Julia went to the window and pointed outside. It's raining. Alice collapsed to a sit on the floor. No. We're going to the diner. Remember the diner? We were there last week. Yummy pie. Put your shoes on. No. Smelly shoes. Julia threw up her hands in dramatic despair. All right, then. You stay here with Jake and Elwood. I'll bring you home some pie. She went into the kitchen. With slow, exaggerated movements, she gathered her keys and purse, then put on her coat. She was halfway to the door when she heard Alice stand up. Girl, go? Julia didn't let herself smile as she turned around. Alice stood there, her little face scrunched in a scowl that was equal parts worry and anger. Her overalls were splattered with paint from their last art project. Julia meant to be firm, to say, I'm sorry you can't go without shoes, not to a restaurant, and pretend to go on her way while Alice hurriedly put on her shoes. That was what she would have done with an ordinary stubborn child. Instead, Julia went to her and knelt down so that they were eye to eye. Remember our talk about rules? Good girl. Bad girl. Julia winced at the characterization, but rules of behavior were a complex idea. They took years to process and understand. It was one of the hallmarks of socialization. Societies only existed in the presence of rules that governed people's behavior. Some places make little girls wear shoes. Girl no like. I know, honey. How about this? No shoes in the car. You put them on in town and take them off when we leave. Okay? Alice frowned in thought. No socks. Okay. Alice dutifully crossed the room and got her shoes out of the box by the front door. Without bothering with a coat, she went outside. As she stepped onto the porch, a cloud crossed the sky overhead, casting the yard in shadow. The drizzling rain turned to tiny flakes of snow. They kissed Alice's dark head and upturned face, immediately turning to droplets of freezing water. Look, Julie! Pretty! It was snowing, and Alice was barefooted. Perfect. Julia grabbed Alice's coat and scooped the girl into her arms, carrying her to the car. She was halfway there when she heard the phone ring. That's probably Aunt Ellie telling us to watch the snow. She strapped Alice into the car seat. Icky, tight, bad. Alice said, running through her words for displeasure. "Smelly." "It does not smell, and it keeps you safe." That shut Alice up. Julia put a CD in the player and drove away. Alice listened to the Pete's Dragon soundtrack 7 times without pausing. Her favorite song was Candle on the Water. Every time it ended, she cried out, "Again!" until Julia complied. Finally, they pulled into a spot in front of the Raindrop and parked. The song snapped off. "Again?" "No, Alice, not now." Julia leaned sideways and tried to put Alice's clammy feet into her boots. It was like trying to put surgical gloves on wet hands. "Next time, I'm going to the mat for socks." She got out of the car and came around to Alice's side. Opening the door, she smiled. "You ready?" Fear flashed through Alice's eyes, but she nodded. "You're such a brave girl." Julia helped Alice out of the seat. Alice moved slowly toward the restaurant, staring down at her feet. "Don't be afraid, Alice. I'm right here. I won't let go." Alice clung so tightly it hurt, but didn't say a word. Julia opened the diner's door. A bell tinkled overhead. At the sound, Alice shrieked and threw herself at Julia. She bent down to hug the girl, held her tightly. The Grimm sisters were at the cash register, standing shoulder to shoulder. They'd obviously turned in unison at the noise, for now they were staring at Alice. Rosie Tchaikovsky was behind them, tucking a pencil in her pink beehived hair. To the left, an old logger sat alone in a booth. Everyone was staring at Julia and Alice. They should have come an hour ago, between the breakfast and lunch crowds. That was what she'd done last week, and they'd had the place to themselves. Slowly, she stood back up. The Grimm sisters advanced, 3 abreast. Julia had a sudden thought about the horsemen of the apocalypse. These days, apparently, death rode in a battered urn in an old woman's arms. They stared at Julia, then at Alice. Julia stared back. Alice snorted nervously, tugged on Julia's hand. Violet reached into her purse and pulled out a bright purple plastic coin purse. "Here you go. My granddaughter loves these." Alice's eyes lit up at the gift. She touched it reverently, took it in her small hand, and stroked her cheek with it. After a moment she blinked up at Violet and said, "Anku." The 3 old women gasped and looked at one another. Finally, they looked at Julia. "You saved her," Daisy said in a stiff voice, obviously bothered by the emotion behind the words. "Your mom would be so proud," Violet said, nodding to her sisters for confirmation. They bobbed their heads in unison. Julia smiled. For the first time in her life, she felt admired in this town, accepted. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without all of you. The town really protected us." "You're one of us," Daisy said simply. As one, the trio turned and left the diner. Tightening her hold on Alice's hand, Julia led her to a booth in the corner. There they ordered grilled cheese sandwiches, fries, and milkshakes from Rosie. The food hadn't been served yet when the bell over the door tinkled again. Alice glanced up and said, "Max," matter-of-factly. He didn't see them until he'd picked up his lunch order and turned for the door. When he looked at her, Julia's heart did a little flip. "Hey," he said. She smiled up at him. "No date for lunch, Doctor?" "Not yet." "Then perhaps you should join us?" He looked down at Alice. "May I sit next to you?" Her little face scrunched in thought. "No hurt, Julie?" Max looked surprised by that. "I wouldn't dream of it." When he saw Alice's confusion, he said softly, No hurt, Julia. Alice finally scooted sideways to make room for him. Max sat down across from Julia. He'd barely made contact with the vinyl seat when Rosie swooped in beside him. She was grinning from ear to ear. "It's like watching the moon landing. I knew it was true about you two." She set out a place setting in front of him. "Alice is my patient," Max said evenly. Rosie winked one heavily made-up false-lashed eye. "Course she is." When she was gone, Max said, "Before I finish my sandwich, everyone in town will know about this. Every patient I see for a week will ask about you." A few minutes later, Rosie showed up with their lunches. "Uncle," Alice said, grinning up at the waitress. Rosie returned to the kitchen. Julia was about to tell Alice to eat one French fry at a time when she realized that Max was staring at her. She met his gaze and saw fear in his blue eyes. He was afraid of her, of them. It was a fear she understood. It had shaped much of her life. Passion was a dangerous thing, and love even more so. More often than not, it was love that had devastated her patience, either its excess or its lack. But Alice had taught her a thing or two about love and courage. "What?" he said, unsmiling. Julia felt something new, a kind of opening wonder. She wasn't afraid anymore. "Come here," she said it softly. Frowning, he leaned toward her. She kissed him. For a heartbeat of time, he resisted. Then he gave in. Alice giggled. "Kisses!" When Max drew back, he was pale. Julia laughed. Might as well give the gossip something to talk about. After that, they went back to their lunches as if it hadn't happened. Later, as they stood at the front door putting their coats on, Julia dared to touch his arm. She'd already branded him publicly with her mouth. What was a touch on the arm after that? "I'm taking Alice to the game farm in Squim. Would you like to join us?" He paused just long enough to look at his watch, then said, "I'll follow you." Julia bustled Alice out of the restaurant and back into the car. By the time they reached the entrance to the game farm, it was snowing in earnest. Big, fluffy white flakes fell from the sky. A few had begun to stick. A thin layer of white had formed on the fence line and on the grass. Julia pulled up to the small wooden house where the farm's owner lived. A pair of black bear cubs sat on the porch, chewing on huge sticks of wood. "You need to put on your boots, your gloves, and your coat," Julia said. "No." "Stay in the car, then." Julia bundled up and got out of the car. She joined Max, who stood by his own car. Snow peppered them, landed like bits of fire on her nose and cheeks. "What are we waiting for?" he asked. "You'll see." The car door opened. Alice climbed out. She was dressed for the weather, except that her boots were on the wrong feet. Just then, Floyd came out of the house, wearing a huge Arctic parka. Stepping past the playing bear cubs, he walked down the porch steps and across the snowy yard. "Hello, Dr. Cates. Dr. Saracen." At Alice, he bent down. "And you must be Alice. I know a friend of yours." Alice hid behind Julia. "It's okay, honey. This is your surprise." Alice looked up. "Prize?" "Follow me," Floyd said. They hadn't taken more than 3 steps when the howling started. Alice looked up at Julia, who nodded. Alice ran toward the sound. It was sad and soulful, that cry. It floated on the icy air. Alice answered in her own howl. They came together at the chain-link fence, the little girl in the black woolen coat and the oversized boots on the wrong feet, and the wolf that was now almost half its full-grown size. Floyd went to the gate. Alice was beside him in an instant, jumping up and down. "Open! Play! Girl!" He worked the lock. When it clicked, he turned to Julia. "Are you sure it's safe?" "I'm sure." He eased the door open. Alice slipped into the pen. She and the wolf rolled around together, playing like littermates in the snow. Every time he licked her cheek, Alice giggled. Floyd shut the gate again. He stood there watching them play. "This is the first time he's stopped howling since I got him." "She missed him, too," Julia said. "What do you suppose?" "I don't know, Floyd." They fell silent again, watching the girl and wolf roll around in the snow. "It's amazing what you've done with her," Max said to Julia. She smiled. "Kids are resilient." "Not always." His answer was so quiet, she almost missed it. She was about to ask him what he meant, but before she'd formed the question, she heard sirens. "Do you hear that?" He nodded. The sound was far off at first, then it drew closer. Closer. When the first flashing lights appeared, cutting through the hazy snowfall, Floyd jumped into action. He grabbed Alice's coat and pulled her out of the pen, then slammed the gate shut. Alice dropped to her knees and howled miserably. The police cruiser drove into the yard and parked. The lights remained on, flashing in staccato bursts of color. Ellie walked toward them in the surreal light. "He's come for her," she said without preamble. "Who?" Julia asked. But when Ellie glanced at Alice, Julia knew. Alice's father. Max carried Alice into the house. She weighed almost nothing. He tried not to think about how natural this felt, carrying a child. But some memories were imprinted too deeply to ever erase, and some movements felt as natural as breathing. He tried to set her down on the sofa so he could build a fire. But she wouldn't free him, wouldn't uncoil her arms from around his neck, and all the while, as he carried her around the house and built the fire, she was howling in a quiet way that broke his heart. Finally, he sat down on the couch and drew her onto his lap. Her eyes were tightly shut. Her cheeks were still pink with cold. The sound she made, more whimper now than howl, was the physical embodiment of loss. Too much feeling and too few words. "Look away," he told himself. "Put on a movie or turn up the music." He leaned back and closed his eyes. He knew instantly it was a mistake. In his mind, he heard a child crying. Great big crocodile tears. "My fish isn't swimming anymore, Daddy. Make him all better." Max tightened his hold on Alice. "It's okay, little one. Let it out. That's a good thing, actually." At the sound of his voice, she drew in a sharp breath and looked up at him. It made him realize that it was the first time he'd spoken since they left the game farm. Julia had to go to the police station with Ellie. They'll be back soon. She blinked up at him through eyes that were surprisingly dry. He found himself wondering if she knew how to cry. The very idea of it, that she couldn't release her pain that way, wounded him. "No, Julie, leave, girl?" "No, she'll be back." "Home, girl?" "Yes." He tucked a straggly, still damp lock of hair behind her tiny ear. "Wolf?" Her mouth trembled. The question was so big and complex, yet she asked it all with that one word. "The wolf is okay, too." She shook her head, and suddenly she appeared too old for her face, too knowing. "No. Trap. Bad." "He needs to be free," Max said, understanding her easily. Like birds. You know about trapped, don't you? He stared down into her small, heart-shaped face. As much as he wanted to look away, needed to look away, he couldn't. She made him remember too many moments that had passed. The surprising thing was, they were good memories, some of them. From a time when he'd been able to stand still. A time when holding a child had made him laugh instead of cry. Read, girl? She pointed to a book on the coffee table. It was already open to a page. He picked it up. She immediately resettled herself so that she was positioned closely beside him. He looped one arm around her and opened the book between them. She pointed to the top of the page, very certain where she'd left off. He began to read. Real isn't how you are made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Max's voice broke on that. Read to me, Daddy. He felt Alice's hand on his cheek, comforting him. Only then did he realize that he was crying. Ouch, she said. He looked down at her, trying to remember the last time he'd let himself cry. All better? He tried to smile. All better. Smiling at that, she snuggled up against him. He closed the book and started telling her another story, one he'd spent a long time trying to forget. But some words stayed with you. It felt good, saying it all to someone, even if, by the time he got to the sad part, the part that made him want to cry again, she was fast asleep. 22. The DNA is conclusive? Julia asked. In the quiet of the car, her voice sounded louder than she would have liked. Because of the snow and the falling night, it felt as if they were cocooned in some strange spaceship. I'm no expert, Ellie said, but the lab report indicated certainty. And he knew about the birthmark. I have a call into the FBI. We'll know more in the morning, but... What's her real name? Brittany. Brittany. Julia tested out the name, trying to make a match in her mind. She thought that if she focused on little things like that, tasks, she wouldn't think of the big things. Alice, Brittany, wasn't her daughter. She never had been. All along, the A answer had been this moment, Alice's reunification with her real family. It didn't matter that she had made a fatal mistake and fallen in love with the child. What mattered was Alice. That was the ledge Julia clung to. Why did it take him so long to get here? Ellie pulled into the parking slot marked Chief of Police and parked. Julia stared at the sign. The beam of the headlights seemed to set it aglow. At the same time, the falling snow obscured it. Everything about this night was conflicted, it seemed. I understand you have a job to do, Elle. We both do. We let ourselves get too involved with her. I get it. But I'm a professional. Believe me when I tell you that I never lost sight of the risk I was taking, and I understand what's best for Alice. That's a bunch of shit, but I know why you're saying it. Ellie turned to her. In the weird mixture of light and darkness, her face seemed older and full of shadows. There's a problem. Tell me. Do you know who George Azell is? Julia frowned. It took her a moment to remember. Oh, yeah, the guy who murdered his wife and baby daughter? Sure, he's her father. No. She shook her head. There must be some mistake. The Azell case had been as big a deal as the Scott Peterson trial. The millionaire murderer, they'd called him, referring to the dot-com empire he'd built. A circus of media attention had followed every confusing aspect of the process. The only certainty in the whole proceeding had been his guilt. But He was convicted. He went to prison. How? I'm not the one with the answers. He is. Julia couldn't seem to move, couldn't think. Ellie touched her arm. I can go in alone. Tell him I couldn't find you. No. As Julia stepped out into the freezing night, she tried not to panic. Losing Alice to a loving family was something she would have made herself deal with. George Azell was something else. Not to a murderer, she muttered more than once on the long walk across the yard and up the stairs. All the way there, she tried to remember what facts she could about the trial. Mostly, she recalled that the jury had found him guilty. Cotton ball snowflakes drifted lazily from the night sky, glowing in the pyramids of light from street lamps and windows. Inside the station, it was quiet. Julia blinked, letting her eyes adjust slowly to the light. The main room seemed larger than usual, but that was because she'd usually seen it during press conferences. Cal was at his desk, headphones on, and Peanut stood beside him. Both looked at Julia through worried eyes. Ellie's desk was empty. So was the chair in front of it. He's in my office, Ellie said. Oh. Ellie looked at Peanut, then at Cal. You two stay out here. Peanut's eyes filled with tears. We don't want to hear it. Cal nodded and reached for Peanut's hand. Ellie led Julia through the main room, past the twin jail cells with their open doors and empty bunks, to an open door. On it was a brass plaque that read, Chief. Ellie went in first. Almost immediately there were voices. Hers a little too fast, his gravelly and low. Julia took a deep breath and followed her sister into the office. There were things to notice, of course, bookcases and a desk and family photos, but all Julia saw was George Azell. She might not have recognized him on the street or in a crowd, but she remembered him now. Tall, dark, and deadly. That was how the press had characterized him, and it was easy to see why. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and narrow hips. His handsome face was all sharp angles and deep hollows and bruise-like shadows, the kind of face that darkened easily into anger. Black hair, threaded with gray, hung almost to his shoulders. His was the kind of face that launched a woman's dreams, although he looked worn. "You're the doctor," he said. There was an accent in that voice, an elongation of syllables that made her think of New Orleans, of hot, decadent places and conversations that went on long into the night. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for my little girl. How is she?" Julia moved forward quickly, almost jerkily, and held out her hand. His handshake was firm, maybe even a little more than that. "And you're the murderer," she said, drawing her hand back. She had a sudden urge to wash the feel of him away. A murder one conviction, if I remember correctly. His smile faded. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out an envelope and tossed it on Ellie's desk. "To make an extremely long story short, the Court of Appeals reversed the trial court's denial of a motion to dismiss. It was a sufficiency of evidence thing. The Supreme Court agreed. I was released last week." "On a technicality?" "If you consider innocence a technicality. I came home one day, and my family was gone." His voice cracked. "I never knew what happened to them. The cops decided I was a murderer, and that was it. They ignored any other evidence." Julia had no answer to that. She tried desperately not to feel all this, but panic was stalking her. "She can't survive without me." "Look, Doc, I've been locked up for years. I have a big house on Lake Washington and enough money to hire the best care for her. So let's not beat around the bush. I need to show the world she's alive, so I want her now." She stared at him, actually shocked by that. "If you think I'm going to just hand Alice over to a murderer, you're crazy." "Who the hell is Alice?" "That's what we named her. We didn't know who she was." "Well, you know now. She's my daughter, and I've come to take her home." "You're kidding, right? For all I know, you were behind the whole thing. You wouldn't be the first man to sacrifice a child to get rid of a wife." She saw a flash of something in his eyes. He closed the small distance between them. "I know who you are, too, Doc. I'm not the only one here with a shady past, am I? Do you really want a public fight?" "Anywhere," she said, holding her ground. "You don't scare me." He towered over her, whispered, "Tell Britt I'm on my way." "I won't let you have her." His breath was warm and soft against her temple. "We both know you can't stop me. Washington courts are pro-reunification of the family. See you in court." As soon as he was gone, Julia sank onto a cold, hard chair. Her whole body was trembling. George Azell was right. The Washington state courts valued reunification of the family over almost everything else. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ellie said. "Talking won't help." "Thinking will." She took a deep breath. "I need information on his case." "He gave me this." Ellie pushed a stack of papers across the desk. Julia took the papers and tried to read. Her hands were trembling so badly that the letters shimmied on the white pages. "Jules?" "Give me a minute," Julia said, hearing the desperate edge in her voice. It was taking every scrap of self-control she had to not start screaming or crying, and looking into her sister's sad eyes or hearing comforting words might push her into despair. "Please." She focused on the documents. They represented the bare bones of the procedural history. The original motion to dismiss the case, made by Azell's attorney at the close of the state's case-in-chief, the denial of that motion, the appellate court's reversal, and the state Supreme Court's agreement with the reversal and dismissal. Of all of them, the one that mattered most to Julia was the original certification for determination of probable cause, which outlined the facts of the state's case. On April 13, 2002, at approximately 9:30 in the morning, George Azell placed a call to the King County Police Department to report that his wife, Zoe Azell, and his 2.5-year-old daughter, Brittany, were missing and had been missing for more than 24 hours. The Seattle Police Department responded immediately, sending officers to the Azell residence at 16402 Lakeside Drive on Mercer Island. A county-wide, then statewide search ensued. Community groups responded to the call and organized extensive search parties and midnight vigils. Investigations conducted throughout this period revealed that Mrs. Azell was having an affair at the time of her disappearance and had requested a divorce. Azell was also engaged in an affair with his personal assistant, Corinne Johns. Pursuant to their investigation, police learned the following facts. On or about November 2001, police responded to a domestic disturbance call at the Azell home. Officers observed bruising on Mrs. Azell and arrested Mr. Azell. This complaint was dismissed when Mrs. Azell refused to testify against her husband. On the evening of April 11, 2002, neighbor Stanley Seaman reported another disturbance at the Azell home, although he made no call to police. He stated to his wife that the Azells were at it again. Seaman noted the time of the fight as 11:15 p.m. At almost noon on Sunday, April 12, 2002, neighbor Stanley Seaman witnessed Azell loading a large trunk and a smaller, sack-like canvas duffel bag onto his seaplane. Azel asserts that he took off from Lake Washington in his seaplane with no passengers on or about 1 o'clock on April 12. According to family witness testimony, he arrived at his sister's home on Shaw Island nearly 2 hours later. Experts confirmed to police that the ordinary flight time for that distance would be slightly less than an hour. Azel returned to his Lake Washington residence at 7 that same evening. A local flower delivery man, Mark Ulio, arrived at the Azel home at 4:45 on Sunday to deliver flowers which had been ordered by Azel via phone at 1 o'clock that day. At the time of their delivery, no one answered at the Azel house. Ulio reported seeing a Caucasian male in his mid-30s, wearing a yellow rain slicker and a Batman baseball cap, getting into a white van that was parked across the street from the Azel residence. On Monday morning, Azel called several friends and family members to ask if they knew where his wife and daughter were. He told several witnesses that Zoe Azel had run off again. At 10:30 a.m., when Brittany did not show up at daycare and Zoe missed a meeting with her therapist, Azel called police and reported them missing. Upon identifying Azel as a suspect, police arrived at his home with a search warrant. On a rug in the living room, they found traces of blood. DNA analysis confirmed this blood as Brittany's. Additionally, hair samples found in the couple's bedroom, determined to be Mrs. Azel's, had the roots attached, indicating a struggle. A lamp on a dresser had a cracked base. Throughout the search period, officers repeatedly noted that George Azel was either inexplicably missing during the searches or seemingly unconcerned about his family's disappearance. Such behavior led police to consider Azel a suspect. Based on the information obtained, Sergeant Gerald Reeves placed Azel under arrest for the murder of his wife and daughter and advised him of his Miranda rights. State requests that no bail be granted in this case. This was a brutal and carefully planned and executed crime. Azel's considerable personal wealth, in addition to his pilot's license, makes him a serious flight risk. Under penalty of perjury, under the laws of the state of Washington, I certify that the foregoing is true and correct. It was signed by the detective and dated. When she finished, she sighed and set the papers back on the desk. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Peanut and Cal fought to get through the door. Peanut was first. "Well?" "He's a scum," Julia said, "an adulterer, and almost certainly a wife-beater. But according to the courts, he's not a murderer. He can't be retried for it either. Double jeopardy." She looked at the worried faces around her. "He's also her father. The DNA is conclusive on that. Washington state courts—" "I don't give a shit about state law," Peanut said, looking down at Julia. "What do we do to protect her?" "We need a plan," Cal said. "I'd stand in front of a bus for her," Julia said, and at that she felt herself go calm. The trembling in her hands stopped. "I'd stand in front of a bus for her." It was true. "Time to step into traffic," she said. And though she couldn't force a smile, couldn't in fact imagine ever smiling again, she was okay. She wouldn't think about what if. That would destroy her. She'd think only about Alice and how to protect her. "Hire a detective," she said to Ellie. "Go through Azel's records back to 2nd grade. Somewhere, sometime, this son of a bitch hit someone or sold drugs or drove drunk. Find it. We don't have to prove he's a murderer, just an unfit parent." It was just past 5 o'clock when they got home, but it felt like the middle of the night. Clouds darkened the sky. An inch of snow frosted everything. The lawn, the roof, the porch railing. The house seemed to glow amidst all that whiteness. Ellie parked close to the house. Neither of them made a move to get out of the car. "I'm not going to tell her," Julia finally said, staring straight ahead. Ellie sighed. How will you ever tell her? She hates it when you leave to make breakfast. Julia couldn't go there. Not to the imagining it place. No leave girl, Julie. She opened the car door and stepped out into the falling snow, barely feeling the cold. She walked up the steps, going from snow to wet wood, and opened the front door. The light and warmth hit her first. Then she saw Alice, curled up in Max's lap. At Julia's entrance, she looked up and grinned. "Julie!" she squealed, sliding out of Max's arms and running for Julia. She picked the little girl up, held her tightly. "Hey, little one." She tried to smile. Hopefully it didn't look as brittle as it felt. Alice frowned up at her. "Sad?" "Happy to be home," Julia said. Relief shone in Alice's eyes. She hugged Julia again and kissed her neck. Ellie came up behind them and smoothed Alice's hair. "Hey, girly girl." "Hi, Lily," she said in a muffled, happy voice. Max was standing now. Firelight backlit him. The brightness made his face appear shadowed. "Julia," he said. There was no mistaking the concern in his voice. It almost undid her. She sidestepped his touch, trying to make it look like an accident, but she saw that he wasn't fooled. Of course he wasn't. She didn't know much about Max, but she knew this. He recognized heartache, understood its taste and feel and texture, and he saw it now on her face. There was no way for her to hide it, not with Alice in her arms and George Azel's envelope in her coat pocket. If Max touched her now, she'd cry, and she didn't want that. God knew she would need strength for what was to come. He wants her back. The sad understanding in Max's eyes was almost more than she could bear. He moved slowly toward her. For a second she thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he said, "I'll wait up for you. But it doesn't matter when. Come over when you can. You'll need me." She couldn't deny that. "I'll wait up for you," he said again. This time he didn't wait for a response. He said goodbye to each of them and left. Silence swept in behind him. "Max, bye-bye," Alice said. "No Julie leave?" Julie swallowed hard, feeling the sting of tears. She clung fiercely to Alice. "I won't leave you, Alice," she said, praying it would be true. For the rest of the evening, Julia moved in a fog. Alice seemed to sense that something was wrong. She shadowed Julia even more closely than usual. By 9 o'clock, they were both exhausted. Julia gave the little girl a bath, braided her hair, and tucked her into bed. Snuggling in close on the narrow mattress, she tried to read a bedtime story, but the words kept blurring before her eyes. "Julie sad," Alice said repeatedly, her small face scrunched into a frown. "I'm fine," Julia said, closing the book and kissing the girl goodnight. "I love you," she whispered against the soft, baby-scented cheek. "Stay," Alice murmured, her eyes heavy. "No, it's nighttime. Alice sleeps now." Alice nodded and popped her thumb in her mouth. Julia stared down at the girl. "My girl." An ache blossomed in her chest. She turned away from the bed and went downstairs. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, reading through a stack of papers. The dogs lay on the floor beside her, uncharacteristically docile. "The court said—" Julia lifted a hand as if to ward off a blow. "I can't talk about it right now. I need some time. Will you watch her?" "Of course." Julia went to the kitchen, grabbed the car keys and her purse. Every step seemed to jostle her bones. It felt as if she were held together with old Scotch tape. "Goodbye. I'll be back soon." Outside, she drew in a deep, shaky breath. The night smelled of wet wood and new snow and the coming night. It wasn't until she was almost to the car that she realized she'd forgotten her coat. Freezing, she drove to Max's house. The heat came on just as she turned into his driveway. By the time she crossed the white yard and reached the porch steps, he was there, on the deck, waiting for her. Pale light spilled through an open window and cast him in a beautiful golden glow. She felt a powerful jolt at the sight of him. It came from somewhere deep inside of her, past muscle and bone, a place that was normally still. Coming home. That was how it felt. She climbed the steps toward him. He started to say something else, but she didn't want to hear his words, his voice, his questions. They would be concrete somehow, too heavy. She couldn't carry any more weight right now. She touched a finger to his lips. "Take me to bed, Max." He stared down at her, and for a moment, just that, she saw the man behind the smile, the man who knew a thing or two about loss. "Are you sure?" "You're wasting time. Alice," her voice broke this time. She had to force a smile. "Might have a nightmare. I can't be gone long." He swept her into his arms and carried her up the stairs. She clung to him, her face buried in the crook of his neck. Seconds later, they were in his room. She slid out of his arms and took a step backward. Though distance was the last thing she wanted right now, she felt awkward, undone somehow. She unbuttoned her shirt, let it fall to the floor. Her bra followed. They stood there, separated by inches and yet worlds apart, undressing. Finally, both naked, they looked at each other. When he reached for her, she said nothing, barely even breathed. He circled his hand around the back of her neck and pulled her to him. Off balance, she stumbled a bit, fell into his chest. He kissed her slowly, with a gentleness that was both surprising and short-lived. She reached up for him, coiled her arms around him, stroking his skin, wanting him closer, closer. It flashed through her mind to push him away, to change her mind, say, "Stop, I was wrong, you'll break my heart." But her fear lasted no longer than an instant. Passion twisted it into something else. They moved to the bed. In a distant part of her mind, she saw that he was pushing his clothes aside, making a bower of rumpled white sheeting for their bodies. And then she was on the bed with him, beneath him, her hands desperate against his bare, hot skin. She was breathing so hard and fast she felt dizzy. His name slipped from her mouth to his. Neither one of them heard it. His hands pushed past her defenses, drove her down, past pleasure and into a kind of pain and back to pleasure again. As if from far away, she heard him rip open a condom package. Then her hands were on him, stroking it into place. He groaned and covered her body with his, moving against her until she couldn't think of anything, could only feel. When he entered her, with a thrust that went straight to the core of her, she cried out, terrified for a moment that she'd lost herself in all this need. When it was over, he held her close and kissed her again. It was long and slow and gentle, and it made her want to cry. "You're a good man, Max Saracen," she said throatily. "I used to be." She drew back just enough to look at him. In the pale light from a single lamp, she saw now what she'd refused to admit before, even to herself. She'd been lost from the moment she saw him, certainly from their first kiss. She hadn't merely stepped into love, she'd tumbled headlong, like her beloved Alice, down the rabbit hole, to a place where nothing made sense. It didn't matter now whether he loved her back. What mattered was the love itself, this feeling of connecting with another heart. She could see, too, that he was worried. They'd come to a place that neither had quite expected, and there was no way to know how it would end. In the past, hell, yesterday, that would have frightened her. She'd learned a lot today. Yesterday, I was worried about a lot of things. Today, I know what matters. Alice. Yes, she said softly. And you. Max lay beside her, holding her naked body close, and stared up at the ceiling. It had been a long time since he'd felt this way. He wanted to spend the night with Julia, to wake up beside her, to kiss her good morning, and talk about whatever came to mind. In ordinary times that might have been possible. These were far from ordinary times. A part of her was breaking apart right now. She was holding herself together by sheer force of will. He rolled onto his side and looked down at her. "You're so beautiful," he said, tracing her full lower lip with his finger. "You too," she said with a smile. Her nose brushed his chin. When she smiled, her pale green eyes made him think of misty rainforest mornings, cool and deep and somehow magical. "You're turning me into a romantic," he said. "Then you already were one." He smiled at that. "You shrinks always know what to say, don't you?" She stared at him a long time before she answered. "Don't lie to me, Max. That's all I ask, okay? Don't pretend to feel something if you don't." "I've never pretended with you, Julia." "Then tell me something real." "Like?" She glanced over at the bureau along the wall. There were several framed pictures displayed, images from his life before. "Like about your marriage." "Her name was Susan O'Connell. We met in college. I loved her from the first moment I saw her." "Until?" He looked away for a second, then realized it was useless. Her keen eyes saw everything. Certainly he couldn't hide this pain by looking away. "Believe me, now isn't the right time for this conversation." "Will there be a time for it?" "Yes," he said softly. She kissed him gently, then drew back. "I better go. Alice has trouble sleeping. She'll panic if she wakes and I'm gone." As she said the girl's name, her voice wavered. "The courts will see your best for her." "The courts," she said with a heavy sigh. "You don't believe they'll do the right thing?" "The truth is, I can't think about all that right now. If I do, I'll fall apart. For now, I'm going to focus on proving that he's an unfit parent, one step at a time." "You'll need me." The smile she gave him was slow and steady. It released something in his chest, made breathing easier somehow. "I certainly will." The night passed for Ellie in a river of black dreams and frightening images. When she woke, at dawn, she was edgy and nervous. The first thing she did was pull out the file. Already she'd read the words so often she'd almost memorized them. In the last 24 hours, she'd personally spoken to every single police officer who'd worked the Azel case. In addition, she'd spent nearly an hour on the phone with the best private detective in King County. Every person she spoke to, and every report she read, said the same thing. He was guilty, and the state hadn't proved it. Ellie paced the living room. The dogs followed her everywhere, running into her every time she turned. They were upset by her energy. It was on her shoulders to prove that Azel was a bad guy, an unfit parent, but so far, all she could find was a layer of innuendo, a fog of accusation. He was an adulterer, that was a fact, the only one she'd been able to nail down. Neighbors thought he hit his wife. Jurors believed he'd killed her, but on the basis of nothing concrete. And the media, every journalist she'd spoken to was certain he'd done it. "Guilty son of a bitch" was the label most often used to describe him. But not one story had uncovered previous bad acts. No drug charges, no DUI, not even a drunken disorderly. With a curse, she grabbed her files and left the house. She drove straight to the Raindrop. The diner was the only place open this early in the morning. As usual, it was full of loggers and fishermen and mill workers having breakfast before work. She stopped and talked to people in every booth as she made her way to the cash register. Rosie Tchaikovsky was behind the hostess desk, smoking a cigarette. Blue smoke spiraled upward, joined with the hazy cloud that was always there. "Hey, Ellie, you're in early," she said, pulling the cigarette from her mouth and stabbing it out in the ashtray. Patrons had been smoking in the Raindrop for 50 years. No state law was going to change that. "I need some caffeine." Rosie laughed. "You got it. How about one of Barb's Marionberry muffins to go with it?" "Thanks. Only one, though. Shoot me if I try to order another." "Flesh wound or kill ya?" "Kill me." Laughing, Ellie turned around, heading back for a booth in the empty non-smoking section of the diner. It was a moment before she saw him. He sat sprawled across the burgundy vinyl booth, an empty coffee cup in front of him. He saw her and nodded. Ellie walked over to him. "Mr. Azel," she said.
"Hello, Chief Barton."
He did not look pleased to see her. His gaze flicked over the heavy manila folder she carried. "Can I join you? I have some questions to ask you." He sighed.
"Of course you do."
She sidled into the booth across from him. She looked at him, trying to really see him, but all she saw were tired eyes and deep frown lines. As she was marshalling her thoughts into a question, he said,
3 years.
3 years what? Leaning toward her, he looked deeply into her eyes.
I was in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Hell, I didn't even know about it. I thought Zoe had left me for one of her lovers and taken our kid.
The intensity in his eyes was unnerving.
Imagine how it would feel to be convicted of something terrible, horrific, and put in a cage to rot. And why? Because you made bad choices and let passion rule your life. So I had affairs. So I lied to my wife and family about that. So I sent her flowers after a knockdown, drag-out fight. It doesn't make me a killer.
The jury,
he said with contempt. They couldn't see past my life. Every newspaper and TV station called me guilty within 5 minutes. No one even looked for Zoe and Britt. 2 eyewitnesses saw a strange van on my street the day my family went missing, and no one cared. The police didn't even bother to search for a white guy in a yellow slicker and Batman baseball cap who drove a grayish Chevy van. When I offered money for information, they compared me to O.J. For the last month, I've been waiting every day for the DNA analysis that would give my daughter back to me. I had to get a court order to compare her DNA to the blood found at the scene. And when I get it, I race up here, only to find that your sister is going to fight me for custody.
Rosie showed up at the table.
"Here's your coffee and muffin, Ellie. I put 'em on your tab."
She grinned.
"Along with a healthy tip."
When Rosie left, Azel leaned across the table.
Do you believe me?
She heard a crack in his voice, an uncertainty that bothered her. "You want me to see an innocent man," she said slowly, watching him.
I am innocent. It'll be easier on all of us if you believe that.
It would certainly be easier on you.
How is she? Can you at least tell me that? Does she still suck her thumb? Does she...
Ellie stood up quickly, needing distance between them. She didn't want to hear what he knew about their girl. Alice needs Julia. Can you understand that?
There is no Alice, he said.
Ellie walked away, not daring to look back. She was almost to the door when she heard him call out to her.
You tell your sister I'm coming, Chief Barton. I won't lose my daughter twice.
The next 48 hours unfolded in a kind of faded slow motion. The snow stopped falling. In its wake, the world was sparkling and white. Julia spent every hour working. During the day, she was with Alice, teaching her new words, taking her outside to make snow angels in the backyard. Several times during the day, Alice asked about her wolf and pointed to the car. Julia gently turned her attention back to whatever they were doing. If Alice wondered why she kept kissing her cheek or holding her hand, she showed no sign of it. But it was the nighttime hours that mattered most right now. She and Ellie and Peanut and Cal and the private detective worked all night long, poring through police reports and newspaper accounts and archived videotape. After a long shift at the hospital, Max showed up to help. They read or watched everything they could find on George Azel. By Monday morning, when the meetings were over, they knew every fact of his life. And none of it would help them.
Read, girl?
Julia drew her thoughts back in and glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 o'clock. No reading now, she said softly. Cal is bringing Sarah over to play with you. Do you remember Sarah? Alice frowned.
Julie stay?
Such an ordinary question. Not right now, honey. I'll be back, though. Alice smiled at that.
Julie back.
Julia dropped to her knees. Before she could figure out what exactly to say, the front door opened. Ellie, Cal, and Sarah walked into the house. No one bothered to say anything. Sarah showed Alice a pair of Barbie dolls. Alice didn't respond, but she couldn't look away from the dolls. After a few moments, the girls wandered into the living room, where they played separately, side by side. Alice still didn't know how to interact with other children, but Sarah didn't seem to mind. Ellie touched Julia's arm. You ready? Julia forced a smile and reached down for her briefcase. On the way out, she stopped to talk to Cal. She meant to say, when Alice feels comfortable, she'll talk to Sarah. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Good luck, he said softly, squeezing her arm for comfort. Nodding, she followed Ellie out to the cruiser. In a silence broken only by the thump-thump of the windshield wipers, they drove to the county courthouse. It was a tall, gray stone building set on a hill above the harbor. The wild blue Pacific made a stunning backdrop. Today, the gray sky blurred the horizon, made everything appear watery and indistinct. Family Court was on the main floor, at the very end of a hallway. Of all the courts Julia had once frequented, Family was her least favorite. Here, hearts were broken every day. Julia paused, straightening her navy suit. Then she opened the door and went inside. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor. Ellie matched her step for step, looking ultra-confident in her gold-starred uniform. They passed Max and Peanut, who were seated together in the back row of the gallery. George Azel was already seated in the front of the courtroom with an attorney beside him. He saw them and rose from his seat, moving toward them. He wore a charcoal gray suit and a crisp white shirt. His hair had been tamed into a smooth ponytail.
Dr. Cates, Chief Barton.
Mr. Azel? Ellie said. Behind them, the courtroom doors banged open. Julia's attorney, John MacDonald, bustled in, carrying a worn leatherette briefcase. He looked tired, which was hardly surprising, given that they'd all been up until 4 o'clock that morning, looking for anything to use against Azel. Sorry I'm late. George looked at the opposing counsel, no doubt noting John's brown corduroy suit and pilled green shirt.
I'm George Azel,
he said, reaching for the man's hand. "Oh, hello," John said, then herded Julia and Ellie to their desk. The judge entered the courtroom and took her seat. From there she stared down at all of them. Without preamble, she began. "I've read your motion, Mr. Azel. As you know, Dr. Cates has been temporary foster parent for your daughter for nearly 4 months and had recently begun adoption proceedings." "That was before, Your Honor, when the child's identity was unknown," his attorney said. "I'm well aware of the time sequence, and I understand the procedural history of this case. The question for this court is placement of the minor child. Obviously, public policy favors the reunification of biological families whenever possible, but these are far from ordinary family circumstances." "Mr. Azel has a history of domestic violence, Your Honor," John said. "Objection!" Azel's attorney was on his feet again. "Sit down, counsel. I know he's never been formally charged with that." The judge took off her reading glasses and set them on her desk, then looked at Julia. "The white elephant in this courtroom is you, Dr. Cates. You are hardly the average foster parent seeking permanent custody. You're one of the preeminent child psychiatrists in this country." "I'm not here in that capacity, Your Honor." "I'm aware of that, Doctor. It would represent a conflict of interest. You're here because you won't withdraw your petition for adoption." John started to stand up. Julia stopped him with a touch. No one could plead for Alice better than she could. She looked up at the judge, said, "In any other instance, Your Honor, I would have withdrawn if a family member had come forward. But I've read the records in this case, and I'm deeply concerned for the child's safety. The mother's body has never been found, and there's no finding of not guilty on the record. Mr. Azel claims to be innocent, but in my experience, most guilty people do. I just want what's best for this poor child who has already suffered so much. As you can see from my report, she's an extremely traumatized child. Until recently, she was completely mute. I'm making progress with her because she trusts me. To remove her from my care would cause her irreparable harm." "Come on, Your Honor," Azel's attorney said. "She's a psychiatrist. My client can afford to replace her. The truth is, my client has already suffered a tremendous loss of time with his daughter. Justice demands that he be given immediate custody." The judge put her glasses back on and looked at them all. "I'm going to take this under advisement. I'll appoint a guardian ad litem to assess the child's special needs and current condition, and let you know when I've reached a decision. Until then, the child will remain with Dr. Cates. Mr. Azel is to be granted supervised visitation." The attorney shot to his feet. "But, Your Honor, that's my ruling, Counselor. We're going to proceed with the utmost care here. This child has already suffered enough, and I'm sure your client only wants what's best for his daughter." She hit the bench with her gavel. "Next case." It took Julia a moment to process what had just happened. She still had custody of Alice. For now, at least. She heard John talking to Ellie about the logistics of visitation. Julia knew all that. She couldn't count the number of times she'd been appointed guardian ad litem to protect her child's interests. She eased away from the desk and started to leave the courtroom. In the back, by the doors, she saw Max waiting for her. Then someone grabbed her arm. The grip was a little too tight. George Azel pulled her aside. His Hollywood smile was gone, watered down now by failure. In his eyes was a sadness she hadn't expected.
"I need to see her."
She had no choice but to agree. "Tomorrow. But I won't tell her who you are. She wouldn't understand anyway. We're at 1617 River Road. Be there at 1. She pulled free of his arm and began to walk away. He grabbed her again. She looked down at his long, tanned fingers, wrapped possessively around her bicep. He was a man used to taking what he wanted. He didn't care much about crossing personal space boundaries either. "Release me, Mr. Azel." He complied instantly. She expected him to back away. Cowards who were called out usually did, and men who beat their wives were always cowards and bullies. But he didn't. He stood there, towering over her, and yet cowed somehow, bent.
How is she?
He asked finally. She would have sworn there was a fissure in his voice, that the words hurt him to say. Murderers and sociopaths were often great actors, she reminded herself. It's about time you asked that.
You think you know me, Dr. Cates. The whole world does.
He backed away, sighing, shoving a hand through his hair and pulling his ponytail free.
Christ! I'm tired of fighting a war I can't win. So just tell me, how's my daughter? What the hell does developmentally delayed mean?
She's been through hell, but she's coming through. She's a tough, loving little girl who needs a lot of therapy and stability.
And you think I'm unstable?
As you've pointed out, I don't know you. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a stack of videocassette tapes, which she handed to him. I made these for you. They're tapes of our sessions. They will answer some of your questions. He took them cautiously, as if he were afraid the black plastic would burn him.
Where has she been?
He finally asked. This time his voice was velvety soft. She was reminded of his Louisiana roots. According to the trial transcripts, he'd been raised dirt poor in the bayou. We don't know. Somewhere in the woods, we think. Julia wouldn't let herself be fooled by the concern in his voice. He was playing her. She was sure of it. He wanted her to think he was a victim in this, too. But I suspect you know that. Ellie came up beside Julia, touched her arm. Everything okay? Mr. Azel was finally asking about Alice.
Call me George, and her Brittany.
Julia flinched at the reminder. She's been Alice to us for a long time.
About that,
he looked at both of them.
I want to thank you both for taking such good care of her. You literally saved her life.
Yes, we did, Julia said. I'll see you tomorrow at 1, Mr. Azel. Promptly. Julia nodded and walked away. It was a moment before she realized that Ellie hadn't followed her. She glanced back. George and Ellie were talking. Peanut came up to her, nodded back toward Ellie and George. That's trouble, she said, crossing her arms. Your sister can turn to jello around a good-looking man. I hope not, Julia said, feeling exhausted suddenly. But maybe you should go eavesdrop. Glad to, Peanut said, and she was off. Sighing, Julia walked to Max, who was waiting for her at the back door. 23. Mid-afternoon sunlight, as uncertain as tomorrow, shone through the small barred window and landed in a puddle on the hardwood floor. The girl on the narrow twin bed whined like any other child at nap time.
No sleep. Read.
From his place just outside the bedroom door, Max heard Julia say, Not now, honey. Sleep. Very quietly, she began to sing a song that Max couldn't quite hear. It made him recall another life. In that one, the woman sitting on the bed would have had dark brown hair, and the child would be a boy, named Danny. "One more story," he would have said, that little boy they'd called One More Dan and Dan the Man. Max went downstairs. In the kitchen, he rifled through the cupboards until he found coffee. Making a pot, he then returned to the living room and made a fire. He was on his second cup of coffee when Julia finally came downstairs. She looked worn. He would have sworn her cheeks were streaked by tears. He wanted to go to her, hold her in the way she'd held Alice, and promise her that everything would be okay, but she looked too fragile to be touched. "Can I get you a cup of coffee?" he said instead. Coffee would be great. Lots of milk and sugar. He went to the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, doctored it for her, and returned. She was sitting on the hearth with her back to the fire. Her blonde hair had come free from the twist she'd had it in. Now pale tendrils fell around her face. The area below her eyes was puffy and shadowed. Her lips were pale. "Here." He handed her the coffee. She gave him a fleeting look, a flashing smile. "Thanks." He sat down on the floor in front of her. "I want him to be guilty." "Do you? Really?" Her face crumbled at that. She sighed and shook her head. "How can I want it?" she whispered. "It would make her dad a monster. No child deserves that. As her doctor, I want him to be a loving parent, wrongly convicted. As her mother," she sighed. He had no words to give her. They both knew that either way, Alice, Brittany, would be wounded. She would either lose the woman who'd become her mother, or be taken away from her biological father. Maybe that wouldn't hurt her now, when she couldn't understand what it meant, but someday she'd feel the loss. She might even blame Julia for it. "She needs you. That's all I know. And you need her." Julia's gaze met his. She slid off the hearth and knelt in front of him. "I want to wake up and find that this was all a bad dream." "I know." She leaned forward and kissed him. He felt turned inside out by that kiss. Broken. Now that he'd started feeling again, he couldn't stop. Didn't want to. He drew back just enough to look at her and whispered, "All." At her frown, he said, "You told me once I could have all or nothing from you. I choose all." She tried to smile. "It took you long enough." When Girl wakes up, she goes to the window and stands there, staring out at the yard. She loves these new words, especially when she adds "my" in front of it. This word means something is hers. There are hundreds of birds in her yard right now, though not so many as there will be when the snow is gone and the sun is hot again. Down below, lying on top of the melting snow, is a pink flower. Maybe she should bring it inside. That would make Julie smile, maybe, and Julie needs to smile more. She tries not to think about that, but already it is too late. She is remembering last night, when Julie held Girl so tightly she had to push her away, and how Julie's eyes had watered at that. Lately, Julie's eyes water all the time. This is a bad thing. Girl knows this. Although it now seems long ago that Girl was in the deep forest, she sometimes remembers him and her. Hers eyes watered more and more, and then one day she was dead. The memory of it is terrifying. Before, in days past, Girl would have howled now, called out to her friends in the deep woods. Use your words. This is what she must do now. Using her words is a good thing that makes Julie happy. But which words? And how can she put them together? How can she tell Julie how it feels to be warm, to not be afraid anymore? These words are too big. Too many are needed. Maybe she'll just hold Julie extra tightly tonight and kiss her cheek. She loves it when Julie does that to Girl at bedtime. It is like a bit of magic that makes Girl dream of the pretty things in her yard, instead of how she used to sleep in her cave, freezing cold and all alone. She hears the door to the bedroom open and close. Hears footsteps. You've been standing at that window a long time, Alice. What do you see? Is that a bad thing? There are so many rules in this place. Sometimes she can't remember them all. She turns to Julie, who looks like a princess in one of the books they read. Still, Girl can see the water trails on Julie's cheeks, and it makes her feel sad inside, like the rabbit who'd been forgotten by his little boy in the story.
Bad?
She wonders.
No window stand?
Julie smiles, and just like that, Girl feels happy again. You can stand there all day if you like. She goes to the bed she sleeps in and sits down, putting her legs out on top of the covers.
Book time?
Girl hopes, reaching for the story from last night. Grabbing it, she rushes over to the bed.
Teeth first?
She says, proud of herself for remembering. It is hard to think of such things at story time. And pajamas. Girl nods. She can do it all. Go potty, brush her teeth, and put on the pink jammies with the stiff white feet. Then she is on the bed beside Julie, tucked in close. Julie pulls her sideways, settles Girl on her lap, so they are nose to nose. Girl giggles, waiting for kisses. But Julie doesn't do that. She doesn't smile. Instead, very softly, she says, "Brittany." The word hits Girl hard. It is what him used to say when he was mean and wobbly from the stuff he used to drink. What does Julie mean? Girl feels the panic growing inside her. She scratches her cheek and shakes her head. Julie holds Girl's hands in hers and says it again. "Brittany." This time Girl hears the question in the word. Julie is asking her something. Are you Brittany? Had those other words been there all along, only drowned out by Girl's heartbeat? Are you Brittany? Brittany. The question is like a fish swimming downstream. She grabs onto its tail, swims with it. She gets an image of a little girl, tiny, with short, curly black hair and huge white plastic underwear. This baby lives in a white world, with lights everywhere and a soft floor. She plays with a bright red plastic ball. Someone always gives it back to her when she drops it. Where's Brittany's ball? Where is it? She looks at Julie, who is so sad now it makes Girl's heart hurt. How can Girl tell her how happy she is here, how this is her whole world now, and nothing else feels right? Are you Brittany? She understands, finally. Are you Brittany? Very slowly she leans toward Julie, gives her a kiss. When she pulls back, she says, "Me, Alice." "Oh, honey." Julie's eyes started leaking again. She seems to shrink. She pulls her into her arms, holding her so tightly that Alice can hardly breathe. But she laughs anyway. "I love you, Alice." She says it again just because she can, and because it makes her feel like she can fly. She isn't just Girl anymore. "Me, Alice." At her desk in the station house, Ellie stared down at the huge array of papers spread out in front of her. The tiny black letters swarmed the pages, blurred. She shoved the pile aside, feeling a ridiculous satisfaction when the papers fluttered to the floor. She got up from her desk and left her office. There, alone amidst the empty desks and quiet phones, She paced back and forth. Back and forth. What now? All of their investigations had led them nowhere. There was no way they could convince the court that George Azel was an unfit parent. Julia and Alice were going to lose. Ellie went to the secret cabinet in the back room and grabbed a bottle of scotch, so old it had once belonged to her uncle. "Thanks, Joey," she said, nodding as she poured herself a drink. At the last minute, she decided to take the bottle back with her. Switching on the light, she sat down at her desk in the main room and sipped her drink. What now? It kept coming back to that, like bits of flotsam circling a drain. She was just pouring another drink when the door opened. He stood there, wearing faded designer jeans and a black suede shirt that was open just enough to reveal a triangle of thick black chest hair.
"Chief Barton,"
he said, stepping in.
"I saw the light on."
"It is the police station."
"Ah, so you're always here at midnight, are you? And drinking?"
"These are hardly ordinary times." He nodded toward the bottle.
"Do you have a second glass?"
"Sure." It wasn't exactly professional, but she was off duty, and right now she didn't care. She went into the kitchen, got him a glass and ice, and returned to her desk. In her absence, he dragged a chair over to sit across from her. She handed him the glass. The ice clinked against the sides. She studied him closely, noticing the shadows beneath his eyes that told of sleepless nights, the thin strips of scarring that lined the inside of his left wrist. Sometime, long ago, he'd tried to kill himself.
"I love her, you know, regardless of what you think you've learned from all those reports on the floor."
His words struck her deeply, found a soft place to land. They were compelling, no doubt as he'd intended. She leaned back from him, needing distance between them. "Tell me about your marriage." He gave a negligent flick of the wrist. The movement was strangely seductive. She was reminded of some rich, idle lord of the realm.
"It was terrible. She slept around, I slept around. We fought like crazy people. She wanted a divorce. It would have been my third."
He smiled disarmingly.
"I'm a romantic in my way."
Ellie knew about that kind of faith. A believer, she thought, like me. She pushed that comparison away. "And where is your wife now?"
"I don't know. If you're wondering why I sound so emotionless when I answer, remember that I've been answering that question for years. No one ever likes my answer. I thought she took Brittany and ran off with some new man."
Ellie watched him talk. There was something deeply seductive about him. Maybe it was in the tone of his voice, so soft and confident, or the way his lilting accent made every word sound carefully considered. "Did you testify in your own defense?"
"Course not. The lawyers said there was too much to cross-examine me on. I wanted to. I would have been convincing, too. I thought about that a lot in prison. Regrets keep you company in there. I paid a fortune to private investigators. The best lead came from that flower delivery man who reported seeing a man in a yellow slicker and Batman baseball cap, sitting in a van across the street from my house."
"And?"
"And we never found him."
"So you wish you would have testified?"
"I didn't know how it would stay with me. People think I'm a monster."
"Is that why you're here? To use Brittany, to prove your innocence?" He gazed at her. There was no smile on his face now, no hint of it in his eyes. He looked as honest as a man with a deeply troubled past could look.
When the world sees that she's alive, they'll have to question all of it.
But she's already been so hurt.
Ah,
He said quietly, sadly.
so have I.
But she's a child,
My child.
he reminded her. And at that, she saw past the regret, past the sadness, to a wounded man who would do anything to have his way. I don't think you understand how traumatized she's been. When we found her, she was practically wild. She couldn't talk or...
I've read the newspaper accounts and watched the tapes. Why do you think I'm talking to you? I know your sister saved Brittany, but she's my daughter. You have to know what that means. I'll get the best help for her, I promise you.
My sister is the best. That's what I'm trying to tell you. If you love Alice... He stood up.
I should leave now. I thought if you knew how much I love my daughter, you'd be a cop. But you're Julia's sister, aren't you? This is one more place I won't find justice.
Ellie knew she'd gone too far in questioning his love for his daughter. You'll ruin her, she said quietly.
I'm sorry you feel that way, Chief Potter. I truly am.
He walked over to the door, yanked it open. Then he paused, looked back.
I'll see you and Brittany tomorrow.
Ellie let out her breath in a sigh. His words, "I thought you'd be a cop," stayed with her for a long, long time. In all the tussle of facts and emotions and fear of the past few days, she'd been focused on Alice and Julia. She'd forgotten that she had a job to do. She was the chief of police. Justice was her job. The night for Julia was endless. Finally, sometime around 3 o'clock, she gave up on sleep and went to work. For hours she sat at the kitchen table, in the glow from a single lamp, reading about George Azel. His life was a web of innuendo and speculation. Nothing had ever been proven. Pushing the papers aside in frustration, she put on her jogging clothes and went outside, hoping the cool air would clear her head. She would need her wits about her today. She ran for miles, down one road, up another, until she was aching and out of breath. Finally, near dawn, she found herself back on her own driveway, coming home. She went to her father's favorite fishing spot and stood there, breathing hard, watching sunlight creep over the treetops. Though the world was inky dark and freezing cold, she could remember how it had felt to be here in the summer with him, how his big, calloused hand had swallowed her smaller one, and how protected she'd felt by that. She heard footsteps behind her. "Hey," Ellie said, coming up beside her. "You're up early." She handed Julia a cup of coffee. "Couldn't sleep." She took the mug, wrapped her fingers around the warm porcelain. In silence, they stared across the silvered field to the black forest beyond. Cal's house was a twinkling of golden lights in the early morning mist. "He's going to get custody, Jules." "I know." Julia stared down at the river, watching the pink dawn light its surface. "We need to prove him guilty." She paused. "Or innocent." "You watch too much CSI. The state spent millions and they couldn't prove it." "We have Alice." Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. Slowly she turned to face her sister. "She doesn't remember anything. Or she can't tell us, anyway. Maybe she could lead us back to where she was kept or held." "Lead us back? You mean... My God, Ellie, can you imagine what that could do to her? We might find evidence. But Elle, she could snap, go back into herself again. How could I live with that? How traumatized is she going to be when Azel takes her away? Will she ever understand that you didn't abandon her? Julia closed her eyes. This was precisely the image that stalked her. If Alice felt abandoned again, she might simply fade back into silence, and next time there might be no escape. I've thought it through from every angle. I was up all night. This is my job, Jules. I have to follow the facts. If we want to know the truth, this is our only hope. Julia crossed her arms as if that simple movement could ward off this deepening chill. She walked away from her sister. Ellie didn't understand what her proposal could mean, how fragile a child's mind could be, how quickly things could turn tragic. But Julia knew. She'd seen it happen in Silverwood. Ellie came up behind her. Jules? I don't think I could survive if Alice cracked again. All roads lead to Rome, Ellie said quietly. Julia turned to her. What do you mean? No matter what we do, or how we do it, Alice gets hurt. No child should grow up without a father, but losing you would be worse. You've got to trust my instincts on this. We need to know. To that, there was no answer. Ellie put her arm around Julia and pulled her close. Come on, Ellie finally said. Let's go make our girl breakfast. Max was getting out of the shower when he heard the doorbell ring. He toweled off, put on an old pair of Levi's, and went downstairs. I'm coming. He opened the door. Julia stood there. He could see how hard she was trying to smile. Ellie wants to take Alice into the woods to see if... Her voice wavered. If she can find... He pulled her into his arms and held her until she stopped trembling. Then he led her into the living room. On the sofa, he once again took her in his arms. What do I do? He touched her face gently. You already know the answer to that. It's why you've been crying. He wiped the tears from her cheeks. She could regress, or worse. And what will she do if Azel gets custody? She started to say something, then paused, drawing in a deep breath. In the silence that followed, he said, This is the time to be her mother, not her doctor. She looked up at him. How is it you always know what to say to me? He tried to glance away, couldn't. Very slowly he pulled away from her and went upstairs. On the bureau he found what he was looking for, a 5x7 framed photograph of a little boy in a baseball uniform, smiling for the camera. His 2 front teeth were missing. He took the picture downstairs and resettled himself on the couch. Julia sat up, alarmed. Max? What is it? You look... He handed her the picture. That's Danny. Frowning, she studied the small, shining face, then looked at Max again, waiting. He was my son. She drew in a sharp breath. Was? That's the last picture we have of him. A week later, a drunk driver hit us on the way home from a game. Her eyes filled with tears. The sight of it should have broken him, plunged him into his loss, but instead it strengthened him. It was the first time he'd said Danny's name out loud in years, and it felt good. I would do anything. He stared down at her, not caring that his voice was breaking or that his eyes were watering. Anything to have one more day with him. Julia looked at the picture for a long time. Then slowly she nodded in understanding. I love you, Max. He took her in his arms and held her tightly. And I love you. He said it so quietly that he wondered if she'd heard, or if he'd only imagined the words. Then he looked in her eyes, and he knew she'd heard him. "Someday, you'll tell me about him, about Danny," she said. He leaned down to kiss her.
"Yeah, someday."
24. "Alice, honey, are you listening to me?"
Read, Alice.
"We're not going to read right now. Remember what we talked about this morning? And again at lunchtime?" Julia tried to keep her voice even. "A man is coming to see Alice."
No. Play Julie.
Julia stood up. "Well, I'm going downstairs. You can stay up here by yourself if you like." Alice immediately made a whimpering sound.
No, leave.
She got up from her chair and raced to Julia's side, tucking a hand into her skirt pocket. Julia's heart swelled painfully. "Come on," she said quietly. Down the stairs they went, side by side, Alice's hand tucked firmly in Julia's skirt. Ellie was standing by the fire, apparently reading the newspaper. Unfortunately, it was upside down. "Hey," she said, looking up at their entrance. Though she wore full makeup and had curled her hair, she still looked tired somehow, and scared.
Hi, Lily.
Alice said, pulling Julia toward her sister.
Read, Alice.
Ellie smiled. "The kid's like a bloodhound on the scent." She ruffled Alice's black hair. "Later." Julia dropped to her knees and stared at Alice, who was smiling brightly.
Read now?
"When the man comes, you don't need to be scared. I'm right here. So is Ellie. You're safe." Alice frowned. The doorbell rang. At the sound, Julia almost jumped out of her skin. Upstairs, the dogs, who were barricaded in Ellie's bedroom, went crazy, jumping and barking. Julia slowly rose. Ellie walked toward the door. She paused for only a moment, long enough to straighten her shoulders, then opened it. George Azel stood there, holding a huge, stuffed teddy bear.
"Hi, Chief Barton,"
he said, trying to look past her. Ellie stepped aside. Julia watched it all as if from far away. She felt like a ghost in the room, recently dead, watching her family gather after her funeral. Everything was quiet and slow. No one knew quite what to do or say. He stepped past Ellie and came into the living room. His curly black hair had been pulled back into a ponytail again. He wore ordinary Levi's and an expensive white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to just below his elbows. Looking at them now, in the same room, the man with the dark curly hair and the chiseled face, and the little girl who was his carbon copy, there was no mistaking the link between them. He stepped forward, letting the teddy bear slide down his hip. He held it negligently by one arm.
"Brittany,"
he said the name softly. There was no mistaking the wonder in his voice. Alice slid behind Julia. "It's okay, Alice," Julia said, trying to ease away from her, but Alice wouldn't let her go. "She's got a strong will," Julia said to him. "She doesn't like to be away from me."
"She gets her stubbornness from me," he said.
For the next hour they were like some terrible tableau in a French film. In the beginning, George tried to communicate with his daughter, talking about nothing, making no sudden moves, but none of it worked. Even reading aloud didn't draw Alice out. At some point she streaked over to the potted plants and crouched there, watching him through the green, waxy leaves.
"She has no idea who I am,"
he finally said, closing the book, tossing it aside. "It's been a long time." He got up, began to pace the room. Then, on a dime, He stopped and turned to Julia.
Does she talk at all?
She's learning.
How will she tell people what happened to her?
Is that what matters most to you?
Fuck you,
he said. But the words held no sting, were in fact kind of desperate sounding. He went around the couch and moved toward the potted plants. He moved cautiously, as if he were approaching a wild and dangerous animal. A low growling came from the leaves. "That means she's scared," Ellie said from the kitchen. Upstairs, the dogs began to howl. George was less than 5 feet from the plants now. Squatting down, he was almost eye level with his daughter. Long moments passed like this, with him silent and frowning, his daughter growling in fear. Finally, he reached out to touch Alice. She threw herself backwards so hard she could have been hurt. A plant fell over, crashed to the floor. He immediately pulled his hand back.
Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you.
Alice crouched on all fours, staring up at him through an opening in the leaves, breathing hard. George took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Julia heard his resignation. It was over, at least for the day. Thank God. Maybe he'd give up. He surprised her by starting to sing, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." It was Julia's turn to draw in a sharp breath. His voice was beautiful and true. Alice stilled. As the song went on, repeating, she sat back on her heels, then got to her feet. Cautiously, she neared the plants and started humming along with him.
You know me, don't you, Brittany?
At that, the name Brittany, Alice spun away and ran upstairs. The bedroom door slammed shut. George got to his feet. Shoving his hands in his pockets, he looked at Julia.
I used to sing that song to her when she was a baby.
He came closer. Julia was going to say something when she heard a car drive up. "Who's here, Elle?" Ellie went to the front door, opened it. "Holy shit!" She slammed the door shut and turned around. "It's KIRO-TV and CNN and the Gazette." Julia looked at George. "You called the press?" He shrugged.
You spend 3 years in prison, Doctor, and then judge me. I'm as much a victim here as Brittany is.
Tell it to someone who'll believe you, you selfish son of a bitch. She tried to rein in her anger. It wouldn't do any good to scream at him with the press right there. You've seen her. Becoming the object of media attention could destroy her. You and I know what it's like when they make you the story. There's nowhere to hide. Don't do that to Alice.
Brittany.
His gaze softened. She thought she saw true concern in his eyes, or hoped she did. It was all she had to seize on.
And you've left me no other choice.
The doorbell rang. Do you really want to prove your innocence? Julia said, hearing the desperate edge in her voice. As she said it, she thought, God help me, God help her. Then she looked at her sister, who nodded in understanding.
I've spent a fortune trying to prove it.
Ellie pushed away from the kitchen counter. You have something you didn't have before.
A small-town police chief on the case? That's not gonna cut it.
Not me, Ellie said, moving toward him. The doorbell rang again. Brittany, Julia said. The name tasted bitter on her tongue, or perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it was the taste of true fear, and she hadn't known it until now. I think she lived in the forest for a long time. Years, maybe. If she did, your wife may have been held there also. Whoever took them might have left evidence behind. George went very still.
You think Brittany could lead us there?
Maybe, Ellie answered. Julia could barely manage a nod.
Is it safe? For Brittany, I mean.
Julia couldn't have answered that question, not even for Alice. Her throat was too full of tears. This is wrong, even if it's for the right reason, she thought. Julia won't let her see the actual site, if we find it, that is. Ellie's gaze was steady. You asked me to do my job, George. Was that another lie? Julia drew in a sharp breath. The room felt full of words unspoken, fear denied. A guilty man would say no.
Okay, he finally said. But we go tomorrow. No dragging it out.
Julia honestly didn't know how to feel. Okay. The word was barely louder than a whisper. And no media, Ellie said. George looked from one of them to the other, as if trying to gauge their honesty.
Okay, for now.
The doorbell rang again. There was pounding on the door. Hide, Ellie said sharply to George, who stumbled into the kitchen and crouched behind the cabinets. Come with me, she said to Julia. The two of them walked to the door, opened it. There were several reporters on the front steps, including Mort from the Gazette. They were already talking when the door opened. We're here to interview George Ozell. We know that's his car. Can you confirm that the Wolf girl is his missing daughter? Dr. Cates, have you cured the wild child? Is she speaking now? Julia stared out at the faces in front of her, feeling distant from them, disconnected. Only a few months ago she would have given anything to be asked the last question, to be able to answer it in the affirmative. Then, the reformation of her reputation meant everything to her. But now, her world was infinitely different. She felt Ellie's gaze on her. No doubt her sister was thinking the same thing. Julia looked out at the reporters who were staring at her, microphones at the ready, willing now to believe her. She could be the one again, the doctor to whom they listened. She knew it was true. Alice could be her living proof, just as she was George's. All she had to do was use Alice, show the tapes, and then present the girl. The progress they'd made was nothing short of miraculous. The journals would be clamoring for articles on her therapy techniques. In the end, after all the times she dreamt of her triumphant return, it was surprisingly easy to smile coolly and say, "No comment." Ellie, Cal, Earl, Julia, and Alice were in the park. They needed to set out before dawn. There could be no witnesses to this trek of theirs. A media trail would ruin everything. George stood apart from the rest of them, his arms crossed, talking to his lawyer. "Can she do it?" Cal asked, voicing everyone's concern. Ellie had no answer to that. "I don't even know what to hope for." She reached out for Cal, held his hand. The warmth and familiarity of his touch made her breathe easier. She had been up most of the night, going through procedural manuals and emailing law enforcement colleagues around the country. She'd put together an evidence-gathering kit and invited Cal along to be their official photographer. Everything had to be done exactly right. If they actually found anything, she needed to preserve the site for county and maybe even federal crime scene investigators. It was dark and quiet out here. Cold. The icy breath of late January scraped their skin and chapped their lips. They'd been here beneath the maple tree for almost a half hour. In all that time, no one had said a word except Julia, who was kneeling in front of Alice. In the darkness, they all looked like apparitions. Alice most of all, with her black hair and dark coat and red boots. "Scared?" She gave a half-hearted growl. "I know, honey. I'm scared, too. So is Aunt Ellie. But we need to see where you were before. Remember what we talked about? Your place in the woods?"
"Tork,"
Alice whispered. Ellie heard Alice's whimper, her trembling voice, and she wanted to stop this thing right now. How could they do this?
"No leave, Alice?"
"No," Julia said. "I'll hold your hand all the time." Alice sighed. It was a harrowing, heart-wrenching sound.
"'Kay."
Behind them, a car drove up. It was the final member of their party. Ellie walked over to the sidewalk, where Peanut and Floyd now stood alongside a game farm truck. Beside them, on a leash, was the wolf, muzzled. "You sure about this?" Floyd asked. "I'm sure." Ellie took the leash from him.
"Wolf!"
Alice cried out, running for them. The wolf jumped at Alice, knocked her down. "Are you going to bring him back?" Floyd asked, watching the pair play on the icy grass. "I don't think so. He belongs in the wild." Floyd's gaze landed on Alice. "I wonder if he's the only one." Then he walked back to his truck and drove away. Ellie looked down at her watch, then went to her sister, who stood alone now, staring into the forest. "It's time." Julia closed her eyes for a moment and drew in a deep breath. Releasing it, she went to Alice and knelt down. "We need to go now, Alice." Alice pointed to the muzzle and the leash.
"Bad. Trap. Smelly."
Ellie exchanged a worried look with her sister. Last night they'd decided to use the wolf to help Alice find her way back to her old life. It had seemed less dangerous in the abstract. "She needs him," Julia said. "Okay, but I've got to keep the muzzle on." Ellie bent down and unhooked the leash. The wolf immediately nuzzled up against Alice.
"Cave, wolf,"
the girl whispered, and off they went, the two of them, toward the woods.
"Tell me that's not a damned wolf,"
George said, coming up to Ellie. "Let's go," was Ellie's answer. By the time the sun crested the trees, they were so far from town that the only noise was their footsteps, crunching through the underbrush, and the silvery bells of the river rushing alongside them. No one had spoken in more than an hour. In a ragged formation, with Julia and Alice and the wolf in the lead, they kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser here, and taller, their heavy boughs blocking out most of the light. Every now and then sunlight slanted through to the forest floor. It looked solid, that light, so dappled with motes that you weren't entirely sure you could walk through it. And still they went on, toward the heart of this old-growth forest, where the ground was spongy and always damp, where club mosses hung from leafless branches like ghostly sleeves. A pale gray mist clung to the ground, swallowing them all from the knees down. Around noon, they stopped in a tiny clearing for lunch. Ellie didn't know about everyone else, but she was uneasy out here. They seemed so small, this band of theirs. It would be too easy to make a wrong turn and simply disappear. The only noise now was the ever-constant breeze. It brushed thousands of needles overhead. They heard the rustling long before they felt the cool touch of the wind on their cheeks. They sat in a rough circle, clustered at the base of a cedar tree so big that they could all hold hands and not make a complete circle around its trunk.
"Where are we?"
George asked, stretching out one leg. Cal unfolded his map. "Best guess? Well past the Hall of Mosses in the park. Not far from Wonderland Falls, I think. Who knows? A lot of this area isn't surveyed."
"Are we lost?"
George asked. "She's not," Ellie said, getting to her feet again. "Let's go." They walked for another few hours, but it was slow going. Thick undergrowth and curtains of hanging moss blocked their way. At a clearing beneath a quartet of giant trees, they made camp for the night, pitching their day-glow orange pup tents around the fire. All the while, as they set up camp and cooked their supper from cans, no one said much of anything. By nightfall, the sounds of the forest were overwhelming. There was endless scurrying and dropping and cawing. Only Alice and her wolf seemed at ease. Here, in all this green murkiness, Alice moved easier, walked taller. It gave them all a glimpse of who she would someday become, when she felt at home in the world of people. Long after everyone else had gone to bed, Ellie stayed up. Sitting by the river's edge, she stared out at the black woods, wondering how Alice had made this trek alone. She heard a twig snap behind her, and she turned. It was Julia, looking worn and tired. Is this the insomniac's meeting place? Ellie scooted sideways, making room for her sister on the moss-furred nurse log. On either side of them, fragile green sword ferns quivered at the movement of their bodies. They sat side by side. At their feet, the river rushed by, almost invisible in the darkness. The night air smelled rich and green. Overhead, the Milky Way appeared in patches between the trees and clouds. "How's Alice doing?" Ellie asked. It flashed through her mind that soon they'd have to start calling her Brittany. Another in a long line of things they didn't want to face. Sleeping peacefully. She's completely at ease out here. It's her hometown, I guess. Her own backyard. Is she leading us somewhere, or just walking? I don't know. I hope we're doing the right thing. Julia's voice cracked on that. They fell silent, both of them questioning their choices. Ellie wanted to avoid talking about George, but out here, where there was nothing but her and her sister and the night sky, it was easy to see things more clearly. Have you seen how George looks at her? Ellie said the words quietly, in case he was awake and listening. Hopefully the sound of the river would drown out their voices. Yes, Julia answered. There was a pause before she said, He looks like a man with a broken heart. Every time she ignores him or turns away, he winces. It's making me nervous. What if we find... I know. Julia leaned against her. Whatever happens, Elle, I couldn't have handled it without you. Ellie slipped an arm around her baby sister and drew her close. Yeah, me too. Behind them, a twig snapped. Ellie jerked around. George stood there, his hands jammed in his pockets.
I couldn't sleep,
he said, walking toward them. Ellie studied him. I guess only Alice can. George stared out at the forest. Quietly, not looking at them, he said,
I'm afraid of what we'll find.
If it was an act, it was Oscar-worthy. Ellie glanced at Julia and saw the worry in her sister's eyes. So Julia saw it too. Yeah, Ellie finally said, tightening her hold on Julia. We're all afraid. Ellie woke at dawn and started the fire. In a heavy silence, they ate breakfast and broke down camp. By first light, they were on their way again, fighting through deeper, denser undergrowth, pushing through spider webs as taut as fishing wire. It was just past noon when Alice stopped suddenly. In this shadowy world of towering, centuries-old trees and ever-present mist, the little girl looked impossibly small and afraid. Looking at Julia, she pointed upriver. No, Alice, go! Julia picked Alice up, held her tightly. You're a very brave little girl. To Ellie, she said, Make good notes and take pictures. I need to know everything, and be careful. Julia carried Alice over to the base of a behemoth cedar tree. They sat down on the soft carpet of moss at its feet. The wolf padded to their side and lay down. Ellie looked ahead, into the green and black shadows that lay ahead. Cal, Earl, George, and his lawyer came up beside her one by one. No one said a word. It took a surge of courage to move forward, to lead them all deeper into the woods. But she did it. They followed the river around a bend and over a hill and found themselves in a man-made clearing. Stumps created a perimeter. Fallen logs were the boundaries. Empty tin cans were everywhere, lying on the hard ground, their silvery sides furred by moss and mold. There were hundreds of them, years' worth. Old magazines and books and other kinds of garbage lay in a heap beside the cave. Not far away, tucked back in a grove of red cedar trees, was a small shake lean-to with no door. To the left, a dark cave yawned at them, its open mouth decorated with ferns that grew at impossible angles, their lacy fronds fluttering in the breeze. In front of it, a shiny silver stake had been driven into the ground. A nylon rope lay coiled around it. One end was attached to the stake by a metal loop. Ellie knelt by the stake. At the end of the ragged nylon rope was a leather cuff that had been chewed off. The cuff was small, just big enough to encircle a child's ankle. Black blotches stained the leather. Blood. She closed her eyes for a split second and wished she hadn't. In the darkness of her thoughts, she saw little Alice, staked out here. It had been the girl's small, bare feet that had worn the circular groove in the dirt. How long had she been out here, going round and round this stake? Cal bent down beside her, touched her. She waited for him to say something, but he just squeezed her shoulder. Slowly, Ellie pushed to her feet. "Gloves on, everyone." Then she made the mistake of looking at George.
Jesus,
he said, his face pale, his mouth trembling.
Someone tied her up like a damn dog? How?
Don't. Ellie could feel the tears streaking down her cheeks. It was unprofessional, but inevitable. "Let's go," she said to Cal. In a silence so thick it was hard to walk through and harder to breathe in, Ellie conducted her first true crime scene search. They found a pile of women's clothes, a single red patent leather high heel, a blood-spattered knife, a box of half-finished dream catchers, and a small ratty baby blanket, so dirty they couldn't be certain what color it had once been. Appliqued daisies hung askew from the trim. When George saw the blanket, he made a strangled, desperate sound.
Oh, my God!
Ellie didn't dare look at him. She was hanging on by a thread here. If the look on George's face matched the sound of his voice, she'd lose it. "Catalog everything, Earl," she said. Behind the lean-to was another stake with another leather ankle strap. This one was bigger. It, too, was caked with dried blood. Someone else had been staked out here. An adult. Zoe. She couldn't even see her daughter, Ellie whispered. Zoe's rope was longer. It allowed her to reach the mattress in the lean-to. Cal touched her again. "Keep moving." She nodded, hearing the thickness in his voice. It matched the stinging in her eyes. She moved forward slowly, studying everything from the pile of junk by an old moss-furred stump to the dirty, stained mattress that lay between two Douglas firs. There were animal signs everywhere. This camp had been vacant for a long time. The scavengers had come in. Back in the trees, not far from the dirty mattress, Ellie found an old trunk, rusted almost shut. It took her a few tries, but she finally opened it. Inside, she found piles of old Spokane newspaper clippings. Most of them were about prostitutes who'd disappeared from the city streets and never been found. The last clipping was dated November 7, 1999. There were also several guns and a blood-encrusted arm sling. Down at the bottom, buried beneath the bandages and newspapers and dirty silverware, was a yellow plastic raincoat and a ratty Batman baseball cap. Behind her, George let out an anguished cry.
He saw it. That flower delivery guy saw the kidnapper parked in front of my house.
Ellie didn't turn around. She couldn't see George right now, but she heard him drop to his knees in the muddy dirt.
If they'd listened, maybe they could have found him before he did this. Oh, my God.
When he started to cry, Ellie closed her eyes. She'd done her job, found the truth. But it wasn't the truth she'd wanted to find. Alice's heart is pounding in her chest. She knows she should run, but she can't leave Julie. Still, she hears the voices here, the leaves and the trees and the river. These are the sounds she remembers, and though there is fear in her chest, there is something else, something that makes her get to her feet. Wolf brushes up against her, loving her. Not far away, his pack is standing together, waiting for his return. This Alice knows. She can hear their padding footsteps and growling at one another. These are the sounds below, softer than the rustling leaves and the rushing water, the sounds of life that fill all this darkness. She bends down. It takes a long time, but she finally frees Wolf from the smelly, icky trap on his face and around his neck. He looks up at her in perfect understanding. She feels sad at the thought of losing him again, but a wolf needs his family.
Fui,
she whispers. He howls and licks her face.
Bye,
she whispers. Then he is gone. Alice looks back up at Julie, feeling such a swelling in her heart that it almost hurts. She knows what she wants to tell Julie, but she doesn't have the words. She takes Julie's hand, leads her well around the place. She doesn't want to see the cave again. Oh, no. They climb over one of the trees Him cut down and push through a patch of stinging nettles. There it is, a mound in the earth, covered with stones.
Mommy,
Alice says, pointing to the rocks. It is a word she thought she'd forgotten. Once, long ago, her mommy had kissed Alice the way Julie does, and tucked her into a bed that smelled like flowers. Or maybe these are dreams. She can't be sure. She remembers a glimpse, a moment. Her bending down, kissing Alice, whispering,
be good for Mommy. Remember her.
Oh, baby.
Julie pulls Alice into her arms and holds her tightly, rocking her back and forth. Alice wishes her eyes would water like a real girl's. But there is something wrong with her. Her heart hurts so much she can hardly stand it.
Love, Julie,
she says. Julie kisses Alice just the way the mommy used to. I love you too. Alice smiles. She is safe now. She closes her eyes and falls asleep. In her dreams, she is two girls. Big girl Alice, who knows how to count with her fingers and use her words to make herself understood. On the other side of the river is baby Brittany, wearing the pants called diapers and playing with her red ball. The old mommy is there with her, waving goodbye. Alice knows she is sleeping. She knows, too, that in the world where she is only Alice, she is in Julie's arms, and she is safe. Julia stood beneath the maple tree in Self Park, with Alice asleep in her arms. No one had told her where to go or what to do after the search and rescue team dropped them off at the fire station. And yet, somehow, she and George had ended up here, like shells washed ashore, at this place where the search had begun. The whop, whop, whop of the helicopters and the peal of the sirens were finally fading away.
What now?
George asked, looking dazed and confused, as if he weren't really waiting for an answer. I don't know. Ellie is going back to the crime scene tomorrow with all kinds of experts.
Did you hear what he did to my baby? How he tied her like a dog and...
Stop! Julia turned to him, seeing the pain in his eyes, the tears. They didn't have all the facts yet. There were tests to run and results to wait for, but all of them knew the truth. George hadn't done this to his family. I'm sorry, George. She wanted to say more, but couldn't. She felt as if she were made of chalk and crumbling away bit by bit.
I guess we'll talk later, when it all fades.
I don't think it will fade for us, George, but yes, later would be good. Right now, I better get my girl home. Despite her best intentions, her voice caught on that. My girl. Our girl, I mean. He reached out cautiously, touched Alice's back. His dark hand looked huge between her shoulder blades.
I never stopped loving her.
Julia closed her eyes. She couldn't think about this now, or she'd fall apart. With a mumbled apology, she turned away from him and walked briskly toward her truck. She was almost to the sidewalk when she saw Max. Light from the nearby street lamp cascaded down on him, made his hair look silvery white. His face was all shadows. Slowly he crossed the street toward her. His boot heels were loud on the worn, bumpy asphalt. Each step matched the beating of her heart. He moved in close, the way lovers did. Are you okay? Try as she might, she couldn't stop the tears from flooding her eyes. No. He took Alice from her and put the sleeping child in her car seat. Then he did the only thing he could do. He took Julia in his arms and let her cry. By the time Ellie finished writing her report and sending out faxes and emailing the right agencies, she was exhausted. She pushed away from her desk, sighing heavily. It was only 10 o'clock, but it felt much later. There was nothing more she could do tonight, so she got up slowly and walked through the station, turning off lights as she went. The off-site 911 service was probably besieged with questions. It was something she'd deal with tomorrow. Outside, the night was still and quiet. A slight breeze tugged at her hair and made the fallen leaves dance along the rough sidewalk. She was almost to her cruiser when she noticed George. He was leaning against a street lamp. He wore no coat. He must be freezing. She went to him. He didn't look up at her approach. Ellie had never been good with words, and none came to her now. He looked at her.
All the big city cops who followed me around, and it was you who found the truth.
I had Alice, Ellie remembered a moment too late. Brittany. He leaned down and kissed her on the lips. It wasn't a romantic kiss, but still, she felt its impact. In other days, other times, this feeling would have been enough to make her reach for him, to deepen the kiss into something. Now, instead, she drew back.
Thank you,
he whispered. It doesn't change everything, she said, hearing the crack in her own voice. Alice needs my sister. Without her...
She's my daughter. Can you understand that?
Ellie's voice, when it finally arrived, was barely there. This was the place truth had sent them. Yeah, I know. 25. By 3 o'clock the next day, all of the major network and cable news channels were interrupting regularly scheduled broadcasts to report on the discovery of Zoe Azel's body in the deep woods of Washington state. Crime lab analysis had confirmed her identity, as well as that of the man who'd been there, too. His name was Terence Speck, and he'd had a long history of problems with the law. He'd been convicted of first-degree rape twice. He'd also been a suspect in all those Spokane prostitute disappearances a few years ago, but no solid evidence had ever turned suspicion into probable cause. He'd been killed in September, a hit-and-run accident on Highway 101. Every newspaper and radio station and television show proclaimed George Azel's innocence. The jury system had failed, they said. A man everyone from waitresses to senators had blown off as a guilty son of a bitch had been innocent. Pundits from court TV, especially Nancy Grace, who'd called him a vicious sociopath with a killer smile, were busy wiping the egg from their made-up faces. Now George stood at the podium in the police station with his lawyer. They'd been answering the same questions all afternoon. The revelation that the Wolf Girl, so easily discarded as sensationalism by them only a few weeks before, was his daughter, only fueled the fire. The headline, "Living Proof," was even now being inked across millions of newspapers. Ellie stood at the back wall, shoulder to shoulder between Cal and Peanut, watching the show. She felt Cal's gaze on her. In fact, he'd been watching her too closely all day. Wherever she went, he was there, standing by but saying nothing. What? What? Peanut laughed. You two are going to have to quit with the philosophical discussions. I can't keep up. Ellie ignored her friend. What, Cal? She said, irritated. There was something in his eyes that upset her. She couldn't help feeling that he'd judged her and found her lacking. Nothing. If you've got something on your mind, you might as well spit it out. We've been friends long enough that I know when you're pissed off about something. What did I do? She expected him to smile at that, maybe make some smart-ass geek boy response, but he just stared at her. After a second or so, she started to feel uncomfortable. Finally, he smiled, but it didn't light his eyes. I don't think that's true, Elle. In fact, I think you hardly know me. With that, he walked away, went back to his desk and sat down. Putting on his headset, he pulled a sketch pad out and began drawing. Ellie rolled her eyes. Peanut didn't smile. He's going all Napoleon Dynamite again, Ellie said, irritated. There's a rumor going round town, he said. I heard it this a.m. myself, from Rosie at the diner, who heard it from Ed at the poorhouse. I'm guessing it's about me? It seems a certain female police chief was seen kissing a certain famous out-of-towner last night, right in the parking lot in front of everyone. Oh, and did I mention his track record with women? She made a tisking sound. Not good. Ellie winced. Actually, he kissed me. Well, that makes a world of difference. Peanut sighed and shook her head. It was exactly how she responded when one of her kids was making her crazy. Ellie, you're a fool. There, I finally said it. I've been waiting for you to wake up and see what's in your own backyard. We both have. But clearly, that isn't going to happen. A good-looking felon comes to town and you're all over him like Gray on Seattle. In fact, I hear wedding bells now. Who cares that he's going to take Alice away from Julia and break all our hearts? What matters is he's got a great smile and a big dick and he knows how to use them both. In the first place, it was a kiss, not a blowjob. In the second... Peanut walked away from her. Ellie ran after her. Come back here, damn it! You can't say something like that to me and just walk away. She grabbed Peanut's arm and spun her around. There were reporters clustered around them, but Ellie didn't care. I didn't go for him, Peanut. From what I heard... Did you hear me, damn it? I didn't go for him. Zero, zip, nada. He did kiss me, and I could have turned it into something, but I didn't. He's going to take Alice from us, for God's sake. How can you think I'd sleep with him? Peanut frowned. Really? You didn't? Kept my jeans zipped, as my dad used to say. Why? It was Ellie's turn to frown. Alice is more important. Nothing used to be more important to you, Elle, than a good-looking man. Things change. Ellie thought about that. It made her smile, feel free. It's about damn time. Smiling, Peanut slung an arm around her. Together, they headed back to Peanut's desk. Hey, what did you mean, we? You said we both have been waiting for you to see. Peanut shrugged. You're smart enough to prove George innocent. You damn sure can open your eyes and see what's right in front of you. Someday you should think about the people who love you, Elle. She looked down at her watch. Hey, aren't you supposed to be in court? Ellie glanced at the clock. Shit, George is already gone. She ran for the door. By the time she reached the courthouse, it had started to rain. Cold, icy drops that fell from a sad, gray sky. She parked on the street out front and ran up the steps. At the closed door of the judge's chambers, Ellie knocked. Come in. She opened the door to a large, austerely decorated room. Books lined all the walls. A huge desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat the judge. Julia stood near the corner beside a huge potted plant. Both attorneys were seated in front of the judge's desk. George stood all alone on the left side of the room. Everyone is here, the judge said, putting on her glasses. The circumstances have changed since the last time you came to me. Yes, Your Honor, said George's attorney. The judge looked at Julia. I know how much you care about Brittany, Dr. Cates. You also know how the system works. Yes. The words seemed to deplete Julia, leave her smaller. I know Mr. Azel is a victim here as much as Alice is, and I hate to further hurt him, but... She paused as if gathering her courage, then looked up at the judge. His needs must be second to hers. The judge frowned. In what way? She needs more time with me. She loves me, trusts me. I can... Her voice slipped, caught on desperation. Save her. Ellie went to Julia, stood beside her. Will she always be a special needs child? The judge asked gently. I don't know, Julia answered. She's come so far. She's extremely bright, though. I believe she can rise above her past. But for many years she'll need constant care and treatment. There must be special schools for kids like her, George said. There are, his attorney answered, and other doctors who could treat her. Your Honor, Mr. Azel is a victim here. We can't compound his tragedy by taking his daughter away again. No, the judge said, and I'm sure Dr. Cates knows that. Julia turned to George. She has no idea who you are, George. I sympathize with you, honestly I do. I was up all night thinking about what you've suffered. But the truth is, your daughter is what matters now. Father is a concept she can't understand yet. And if she were taken from me now, abandoned again, she could regress. She'd almost certainly retreat back into silence and howling and self-mutilation. She isn't ready. I'm sorry. She stared at him, willing him to believe her. Maybe you could move here for a few years. I would keep working with her. We could slowly...
Years?
George looked shaken by that, as if he'd never considered it.
You want me to stay here for years? While my daughter lives with you? While she learns to call you Mommy? And I get to be whom? The man next door? Uncle George?
It was Julia's turn to look shaken. I could move to Seattle.
You don't get it, Dr. Cates.
His voice was gentle but firm.
I love my daughter. All those years behind bars, I dreamed of finding her, of taking her to the park and teaching her to play the guitar.
You love the idea of a daughter. I've read everything there is to know about you, George. When Alice lived with you, you were always gone. She was in daycare 5 days a week. Zoe said you were never home for dinner or on weekends. You don't even know your daughter, and she doesn't know you.
That's not my fault,
he said softly. I love her, Julia said, her eyes filling with tears.
I know you do. That's the problem. That's why she can't keep living with you or be your patient, here or in Seattle.
I don't understand. If I can help...
She'll never love me, he said. Not as long as you're around.
Julia drew in a sharp breath. Slowly she closed her eyes, battling for control. Then she looked up at George. Everyone in the room knew there was nothing she could say to that.
I'll do everything for her, George promised. Get all the best doctors and psychiatrists. I'll make sure she's taken care of. And later, when she loves me and knows who I am, I'll bring her back to see you. I'll make sure she never forgets you, Julia.
In a small town like Rain Valley, the only thing more prevalent than gossip was opinions. Everyone had one and couldn't wait to share it. Max figured that the meeting in the courthouse had barely finished when people started talking about it. He called Julia every 10 minutes. There was never an answer. For almost an hour he waited for her to call him, but his own phone remained silent. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. She might think she needed to be alone. She was wrong. He'd made that mistake for too long, thinking that heartache had to be born alone. He wouldn't let her make the same error. He got in his car and drove to her house. With every turn, he pictured her. She'd be sitting on the sofa right now, or lying in bed, trying not to cry, but one memory of Alice laughing, or eating the flowers, or giving butterfly kisses, and the tears would fall. He knew. She might try to forget it, to outrun it, as he'd done. If so, years might pass before she'd realize that those memories needed to be held on to. They were all you had left. He pulled up to her house and parked. From the outside, everything looked normal. The rhododendrons that guarded the porch were huge and glossy green in this rainy season. A pale green moss furred the roof. Empty planters hung from the eaves. Behind and around the house, giant evergreens whispered among themselves. He crossed the yard and went to the front door, knocking softly. Ellie answered, holding 2 cups of tea. "Hey, Max," she said. "How is she?" "Not good." Ellie stepped back, letting him enter the house, and handed him the cups. "She's up in my room, first door on the left. Alice is asleep, so be quiet." He took the cups from her. "Thanks. I'm going to the station. I'll be back in an hour. Don't leave her alone." "I won't." She started to leave, then stopped and turned to him. "Thanks. You've helped her." "She's helped me," he said simply. He watched her leave, heard her car start up. Then he put down the tea. There would be a time for that later. Making tea was for a relative who wanted to help but didn't know how, and went upstairs. At the closed bedroom door he paused, then drew in a deep breath and opened it. The room was full of shadows. All of the lights were off. Julia lay on her back in the big, king-sized canopy bed, her eyes closed, her hands folded on her stomach. He went to her, stood beside the bed. "Hey," he said softly. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. Her face was red and swollen, as were her eyes. Tears had scrubbed the color from her cheeks. "You know about Alice?" she said quietly. He climbed into the big bed and took her in his arms. Saying nothing, he held her and let her cry, let her tell him her memories one by one. It was something he should have done long ago, formed all his memories into solid, durable things that would last. She paused in her story and looked at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I should stop rattling on about her," she said. He kissed her gently, giving her all of himself in that one kiss. "Keep talking," he said when he drew back. "I'm not going anywhere." The streets downtown were empty. Every storefront Ellie passed, she got a sad, tired wave from someone inside. 4 people had hugged her in the diner while she waited for her mocha. None of them bothered to say anything. What was there to say? Everyone knew that by this time tomorrow, their Alice would be gone. It was late when she finally left the station and headed for the river. As she climbed the porch steps to the front door that had always been hers, she felt as if she were carrying a heavy weight on her back. This was as bad as she'd ever felt in her life, and for a woman who'd been divorced twice and buried both of her folks, well, that was saying something. Inside, everything was exactly as it always had been. The overstuffed sofa and chairs created an intimate gathering place in front of the fireplace. The knickknacks were few and far between and mostly handmade. The only difference was the collection of ficus plants in the corner. Alice's hiding place. Only a few weeks ago, the girl had rushed to that place at the drop of a hat, or the start of a big emotion. But lately she'd hidden less and less in her leafy sanctuary. The thought of it was almost more than Ellie could bear. And if it hurt her to imagine, what was Julia feeling now? Every tick of the clock must be a blow to her. She went over to the stereo and popped the Return of the King CD into the player. It was a day for sad, desperate songs and emotional music. She tossed her purse on the dining room table. It hit with a jangly thump. She'd just made herself tea when she saw her sister. Julia was out on the porch in the freezing cold, wrapped in their father's old woolen hunting coat. Ellie made a second cup of tea and took it out to the porch. Julia took the drink with a quiet, "Thanks," and "Have a seat." Ellie grabbed one of the old quilts from the trunk on the porch and wrapped it around her. Sitting on the porch swing, she put her feet on the trunk. "Where's Max?" Julia shook her head. "He had an emergency at the hospital. He wanted to stay, but I sort of needed to be alone. Alice is asleep." Ellie started to rise. "Should I?" "No. Please, stay." At that, Julia smiled sadly. "I sound like Alice. Brittany, I mean." "She'll never really be Brittany to us." "No." Julia sipped her tea. "What will you do?" "Without her?" Julia stared out at their backyard. In the darkness, they couldn't see much past the river. Moonlight brightened the water. I've been thinking a lot about that. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer. Her voice softened, trembled. It's like watching Mom die all over again. She started to say more, but fell suddenly silent. Sorry. Sometimes... She stood up, turned away. I need to be with her now, she said in a small, breaking voice, and then she was gone. Ellie felt the start of tears. She tossed the blanket aside and got up. What good would it do to sit here by herself and cry? She walked down into the damp grass toward the river. Across the black field she saw the twinkling yellow lights of Cal's house. Someday you should think about all the people who love you, Elle, Peanut had said. Cal had always been on that list. Through both her marriages, all her disastrous affairs, and the deaths of her parents, Cal had always been the one constant man in her life. Even though he was mad at her for something, he was the one man on the planet who saw her as she was, and loved her anyway. She needed a friend like that now. She was at his door in no time. She knocked and waited. No one answered. Frowning, she glanced behind her. Cal's GTO was there, hidden beneath a tan canvas cover and a smattering of fallen leaves. She opened the door, poked her head in, and said, "Hello?" Again there was no answer, but she saw a light on down the hall. She followed it to the closed door of Lisa's study. Suddenly she wondered if Lisa was back. The thought made her frown deepen. Nerves twisted her stomach, made her feel panicky, but that made no sense. She knocked on the door. "Hello?" "Ellie?" She pushed the door open and saw that Cal was there alone, sitting behind a drafting-like table with papers spread out all around him. For no reason she could quite touch, Ellie felt a rush of relief. "Where are the girls?" "Peanut took them to dinner and a movie so that I could work." "Work?" "I thought you'd be out with George tonight." "I need new friends," she sighed. "He was wrong for me. What do I need to do? Take out a billboard?" "Wrong for you?" Cal leaned against his desk, studying her. "Usually you don't figure that out until you're married." "Very funny. Now, really, what are you doing?" She crossed the room toward him, noticing the smudges on his cheek and hands. When she sidled up behind him, felt the touch of his arm against hers, she immediately felt less alone, less shaky. There was a pile of papers in front of him. On the top page was a faded working sketch of a boy and girl holding hands, running. Overhead, a giant pterodactyl-type bird blotted out the sun with its enormous wingspan. He pushed the sketch aside. Beneath it was a full-color drawing, almost a painting, of the same two kids huddled around a pale, glowing ball. The caption beneath them read, "How can we hide if they see our every move?" Ellie was stunned by the quality of his artwork, the vibrant colors and strong lines. The characters looked somehow both stylized and real. There was no mistaking the fear in their eyes. "You're a talented artist," she said, rather dumbly, she thought, but it was so surprising. All those days while she'd been sitting at her desk, doing paperwork or reading her magazines or talking to Peanut, Cal had been creating art. She'd blithely assumed it was the same doodling he'd been doing since Mr. Chi's chemistry class. She felt suddenly as if she were losing her hold on herself. How could she have been with him every day and not known this? "Now I know why you said I was selfish, Cal. I'm sorry." He smiled slowly. It transformed his face, that smile, reminded her of a dozen times long past. "It's a graphic novel about a pair of best friends. Kids. He's a good kid from the wrong side of the tracks with a mean drunk for a dad. She, hides him in her barn. Their friendship, it turns out, is the last true innocence, and it falls to them to destroy the wizard's ball before the darkness falls. But if they kiss, or go farther, they'll lose their power and be ruined. I just started submitting it to publishers.
It's about us, she said. At the realization, it felt as if a doorway somewhere opened, showed her a glimpse of a hallway she'd never seen. Why didn't you show me before?
He tucked a strand of hair behind his ear and stood up to face her. You stopped seeing me a long time ago, Elle. You saw the gangly, screwed-up kid I used to be, and the quiet, always-there-for-you guy I became. But you haven't really looked at me in a long time.
I see you, Cal.
Good. Because I've waited a long time to tell you something.
What?
He took her by the shoulders, held her firmly, and he kissed her. Not a friendly peck or an I hope you feel better brushing of the lips. An honest-to-God, send the blood rushing to her head kiss. Tongue and all. Ellie resisted at first. It was all so unexpected. But Cal wasn't letting her run the show this time. He backed her up against the wall and kept kissing her until her breathing was ragged and her heart was beating so fast she thought she'd faint. It was a kiss that held back nothing and promised everything. When he finally drew back, making her whimper at the sudden loss, he wasn't smiling. You get it now?
Oh, my God!
Everyone in town knows how I feel about you. He kissed her again, then drew back. I was beginning to think you were stupid. She didn't know how a nearly 40-year-old, twice-divorced woman could feel like a teenage girl again, but that was exactly how she felt, all giddy and breathless. In an instant, her whole life had clicked into place. It all fit now. Cal! Behind them, the door opened. Ellie turned around slowly, still feeling dazed. Peanut stood in the doorway. Like flowers from a single stem, 3 little faces hovered beside her. Peanut said, "Go put on your jammies. Daddy will be up in a minute to put you to bed." When they were gone and their footsteps on the stairs had faded to nothing, Peanut's gaze moved from Cal to Ellie and back to Cal. A smile finally tugged at the corners of her mouth. "You kiss her?" Ellie had the thought, Peanut knew? And felt a flash of irritation. Then Cal was pulling her toward him, and she forgot about everything else. In those eyes she'd known forever, she saw love. True this time. The kind that began on a cold day between 2 kids and lasted for a lifetime. He squeezed her hand. "I did." Peanut laughed. "It's about damn time." Ellie put her arms around Cal and kissed him. She didn't care if Peanut was watching. It wouldn't have mattered if she'd been on Main Street in uniform during a traffic stop. All her life she'd been looking for love, and it had been there all along, across the field, waiting for her. "It is," she whispered against his lips. "About damn time." Julia knew she was holding Alice too tightly, but she couldn't seem to let go. Neither could she think of her as Brittany. For the last hour, no matter what she did, or appeared to be doing, Julia was also watching the clock, thinking, not yet. But time kept moving on, slipping past her. Every second that passed brought her closer to the time when George would drive up to the house and knock on the door and demand his daughter.
"Read, Alice!"
The child thumped her finger on the page. Somehow she knew exactly where they'd left off. Julia knew she should close the book quietly, say that it was time to talk of other things, of families that had been split up, and fathers who came back. But she couldn't do it. Instead, she let herself hold her little Alice and keep reading, as if this were any other rainy January day. "Weeks passed," she read, "and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit any more, except to the boy." Julia's voice gave out on her. She sat there staring at the words, watching them blur and dance on the page.
"Want Alice real?"
She touched Alice's velvety cheek. Every time they read this story, Alice said the same thing. Somehow the poor little girl thought she wasn't real. And now there was no time to prove otherwise to her. "You're real, Alice, and so many people love you." "Love," Alice whispered it softly, as she always did, with a kind of reverence. Julia closed the book and set it aside, then pulled Alice onto her lap so they were looking at each other. Alice immediately looped her arms around Julia's neck and gave her a butterfly kiss. Then she giggled. "Be strong," Julia thought. "You remember Mary and the secret garden, and the man who loved her so much, the man who was her father? He'd been gone, remember?" Julia lost steam. She stared into Alice's worried face and felt as if she'd fallen into the turquoise pools of her eyes. "There's a man. George. He's your father. He wants to love you."
"Alice loves Julie."
"I'm trying to tell you about your father, Alice. Brittany. You have to be ready for this. He'll be here soon. You have to understand."
"Be mommy?"
Julia almost gave in, but a glance at the clock reminded her how short time was. She had to try again. Alice had to understand that she wasn't abandoning her, that she had no choice. She glanced over at the suitcase she'd packed so carefully last night. In it were all of the clothes and toys the town had gathered for their girl. Additionally, Julia had packed all of Alice's favorite books and a few of her own childhood favorites that they hadn't gotten around to yet. And there were the boxes that had been donated by the local families. Everyone in town had given their Alice something. How would she button Brittany's coat, kiss her on the cheek, and say goodbye? "You'll be fine. Go off with this man you don't know and who doesn't know you. Go live in a big house, on a street you can't cross without help, in a city where you'll never quite be understood." How could she do it? And how could she not? No matter how she tussled with all of this, she couldn't escape the fact that George Azel was a victim in this, too. He'd lost his daughter and found her again, against all odds. Of course he wanted to take her home, and he'd hired all the best medical professionals to care for her. Julia was terrified that it wouldn't be enough, but she didn't know how to stop the inevitable. She drew in a ragged breath and tightened her hold on Alice. Outside, she heard a car drive up.
"Mommy?"
Alice said again. This time it was her little girl's voice that sounded wobbly and afraid. "Oh, Alice," she whispered, touching her soft pink cheek. "I wish I could be that for you." Alice has a very bad feeling. It is like the time when him first left, and she was so hungry that she ate the red berries off the bush by the river and threw up. Julie is saying things that Alice can't make herself understand. She is trying hard. She knows these words are important. Father, chance, daughter. Julie says them all slowly as if they weigh down her tongue. Alice knows they mean something important. But she cannot understand, and the trying is hurting now. Julie's eyes keep watering. Alice knows this means Julie is sad. But why? What has Alice done wrong? She has tried so hard to be good. She showed the grown-ups the bad place in the woods, even went to the rocks that covered her, even though it made Alice feel so sad. She let herself remember things she'd tried to forget. She learned to use forks and spoons and the toilet. She'd let them call her Alice, and had even learned to love that word, to smile inside when someone said it and meant her. So, what is left? What has she not done? She knows about leaving. Mommies who are soon to be dead have pale cheeks and shaking voices and leaking eyes. They try to tell you things you don't understand, hug you so tightly you can't breathe. And then one day, they're gone, and you're alone, and you wish your eyes would leak and someone would hold you again, but you're alone now, and you don't know what you did wrong. Alice feels that sick stomach feeling coming back, the panic that makes breathing hurt. She keeps trying to figure out what she has done wrong. "Shoes!" she says suddenly. Maybe that is it. She never wants to wear her shoes. They pinch her toes and squish her feet, but she will sleep in them if Julie will keep loving her. "Shoes!" Julie gives Alice a sad, sorry smile. From outside comes a sound, like a car driving into the yard. "No shoes now, honey. We're inside." How can she say, "I'll be good, Julie"? Always, always. "I'll do everything you say." "Good girl." She whispers it as a promise, meaning it with every piece of her. Julie smiles again. "Yes, you're a very good girl, honey. That's why all this hurts so much." It isn't enough being a good girl. That much she understands. "No, leave Alice," she says desperately. Julie looks toward the glass box that holds the outside, the window. She is waiting, Alice knows, for something bad. Then Julie will leave, and Alice will be girl again, and she will be alone. "Good girl," she says one more time, hearing the crack in her voice. There is nothing else she can say. She runs across the room and picks up her shoes, trying to put them on the right feet. "Shoes! Promise!" But Julie says nothing, just stares outside. 26. Ellie saw the clot of news vans parked on either side of the old highway. A white police barricade had been set up across her driveway, barring entrance. Peanut stood in front of it, her arms crossed, a whistle in her mouth. Ellie hit the lights and siren for a second. The sound cleared the street instantly. Reporters parted into two groups and went to either side of the road. She pulled around the barricade and rolled down her window to talk to Peanut. "They're a roadside hazard. Get Earl and Mel out here to disperse the crowd. This day is bad enough without the media." A bright red Ferrari pulled up behind the cruiser. Ellie looked in her rearview mirror. George smiled at her, but it was faded, less than real. There was a sad, haunted look in his eyes. Reporters swarmed his car, hurling questions. "What are you going to do now? Will there be a funeral? Who'd you sell your story to?" "Get them out of here, Peanut," she said, then stepped on the gas. The Ferrari followed her down the potholed gravel road. Ellie kept looking in her mirror, hoping he'd turn around or disappear. By the time she pulled up in front of the porch, her stomach was coiled into a tiny ball. She parked and killed the engine, then got out of the car. George walked over to her.
"How do I look?"
he said, sounding nervous. He tucked a wavy strand of hair behind one ear. "Good." She cleared her throat. "You look good." He smiled, and it took over his face, wiping away the nervousness, lighting those blue eyes. Then his smile faded. He looked at the house and said,
"It's time."
His voice was soft, seductive. She wondered how many women had been drawn into the darkness by it and left there alone, wondering vaguely how they'd gotten so lost.
"I told your sister I'd pick up Brittany at 3.
Brittany. With a sigh, she led him across the yard. They were almost to the steps when a gray Mercedes pulled up behind them and parked. "Who's that?" she asked George.
"Dr. Corell. He's going to work with Britt."
The man got out of his car. Tall, thin, almost elegantly effete, he walked toward them. His lean face showed plenty of lines, but no hint of personality. "George." He nodded at George, then he shook Ellie's hand. "I'm Tad Corell." He had the grip strength of a toddler. Ellie had an almost overwhelming urge to cold-cock him. "Nice to meet you." She was about to turn away when she noticed the hypodermic needle sticking out of his breast pocket. "What's that for? You a heroin addict?" "It's a sedative. The girl might be upset by the transition." "You think?" Ellie couldn't help looking at George. She knew it was in her eyes, the pleading, the desperate, "Don't do this." But she didn't say it again.
"She's my daughter,"
he said quietly. There was no answer to that. Ellie knew that if she were in his shoes, no force on earth would keep her from her child. She nodded. The three of them headed for the house. At the front door, Ellie knocked. Anything to put off the inevitable. Then she opened the door. Julia sat on the sofa with Alice tucked beside her. At the foot of the sofa was a small red suitcase. Julia looked up at them. Her beautiful face glistened with tear tracks. Her eyes were puffy and bloodshot. She didn't move. Ellie was pretty sure she couldn't. At the knock, Julia's legs had probably given out on her. Max stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Mr. Azel," Julia said in a shaky voice, "I see you've brought Dr. Corell." She nodded at the doctor and got to her feet. "Your reputation precedes you, Doctor."
"As does yours,"
Dr. Corell said. There was no hint of sarcasm in his voice. "I watched the tapes. Your work with her has been phenomenal. You should publish it in the journal." Julia looked down at Alice, who looked scared now.
"Julie?"
Alice said, her voice spiking up in fear.
"It's time for you to go now,"
Julia said in a voice so quiet they all moved a little closer to hear. Alice shook her head.
"No go. Alice, stay."
"I wish you could, honey, but your daddy wants to love you too." She touched Alice's tiny face. "You remember your mommy? She would have wanted this for you."
"Julie, Mommy!"
There was no mistaking the fear in Alice's voice now. She tried to hug Julia more tightly. Julia worked to uncoil the girl's spindly arms. "I wanted to be, but I'm not. No, Julie, Mommy. You have to go with your father." Alice went crazy, kicking and screaming and growling and howling. She scratched Julia's face and her own. "Oh, honey, don't," Julia said, trying to calm the child, but she was crying too hard to be heard. Dr. Corell swooped in and gave Alice a shot. The child howled at that, a huge, desperate wail that came from all the dark places she'd seen in her life. Ellie felt tears in her own eyes, stinging, blurring everything. Julia held on to Alice, who slowly quieted as the sedative took effect. "I'm sorry," Julia said to her. Alice's eyes blinked heavily. She coiled her arms around Julia and stared at her.
"Love, Julie."
"And I love Alice." At that, Alice started to cry. It came with no sound, no shuddering, no childlike hysterics, just a soul-deep release that turned into moisture and dripped down her puffy pink cheeks. She touched her tears, frowning. Then she looked up at Julia and whimpered 2 words before she fell asleep.
Real hurts.
Julia whispered something none of them could hear. She looked ruined by those quietly spoken words and Alice's tears. They all stood there a moment, staring at each other. Then Dr. Carew said, "We should hurry." Julia nodded stiffly and carried Alice out to the Ferrari. She looked down into the passenger seat, then turned to George. "Where's her booster seat?"
She's not a baby, he said.
"I'll get it," Ellie said, going to the truck. Somehow, that did it to her, after all she'd just seen. Unhooking the booster seat, Alice's seat, and yanking it out of the truck, made her cry. She tried to hide her face from George as she fit the seat into the Ferrari. Very slowly, Julia bent down and put the sleeping child into the car. She whispered something into Alice's tiny ear. None of them heard what it was. Then she kissed her cheek and backed away, shutting the car door gently. Julia stood face to face with George. She handed him a thick manila envelope. "This is everything you need to know. Her nap times, bedtimes, allergies. She loves Jell-O now, but only if it has pineapple in it, and vanilla pudding. She tries to play with pasta, so unless you want a real mess, I'd keep it away from her. And pictures of bunnies with big ears will make her giggle. So will tickling the bottoms of her feet. Her favorite book—"
"Stop!"
George's voice was harsh, throaty. He took the envelope in shaking hands.
"Thank you. For everything. Thank you."
"If you have problems, you'll call. I can be there in no time."
"I promise."
"I want to throw myself in front of your car."
"I know."
"If you—" Her voice cracked. She wiped her eyes, said, "Take care of our girl."
"I will."
Overhead, a cold breeze rustled through the leaves. In the distance, a crow cawed, then another. Ellie half expected to hear a wolf howl.
"Well," George said, "we need to go."
Julia stepped back. Ellie went to her sister, put an arm around her. Julia felt frail and too thin suddenly, like someone who has been hospitalized for a long time and had only recently gotten out of bed. Max came up too. They bookended her. Without their steadying presence, Ellie thought her sister might collapse. George got into his car and drove away. Dr. Carew followed. For a few moments their tires crunched on the gravel driveway, their engines purred. Then there was no sound left, no trace of them. Just the wind. "She cried," Julia whispered, her whole body trembling. "All the love I gave her. And in the end, all I did was teach her to cry." Max pulled Julia into his arms and held her tightly. There was nothing more they could say. Alice was gone. She is in a car. But it is not the kind of car she knows. This one is low, almost on the ground, and it darts around like a snake. The music is so loud it hurts her ears. She opens her eyes slowly. She feels funny, kind of wobbly and sick and tired. Her stomach might throw everything out of her mouth if she's not careful. Wetting her dry lips, she looks around for Julie or Lely. They are not here. She feels the panic start deep inside her and blossom out. The only thing that stops her from screaming is how tired she is. She can't seem to make a big noise. He can probably hear her heartbeat. It is so loud he will probably yell at her. She covers her heart with her hand to quiet the sound.
Julie?
She says to the man.
She's back in Rain Valley. We're long gone, but you're with me now, Brittany, and everything will be good.
She doesn't understand all his words, but she knows gone. Her eyes start watering. It hurts, this crying. She wipes the tears away, surprised a little that they are clear. They should be red as her blood. That's how it feels. As if she has been poked with the sharp knife again and is bleeding. She remembers bleeding.
Julie, Mommy, gone. Alice, bad girl.
The man looks at her. He is frowning. She knows he will hit her now, but she doesn't care. Julie can't make it all better anymore. Just thinking it makes her eyes water more. She starts howling, softly, though she knows there is no one to hear. She is too far from her place. Her howling grows louder, more desperate.
Brittany?
She says nothing. The only way to protect herself is in the quiet. She has no one to care for her anymore, so she needs to be small and still. She closes her eyes, lets the sleep come for her again. It is better to dream of Julie, to pretend. In her dreams, she is a good girl and has a Julie mommy to love her. Sometime later, Julia had no idea when, she had lost her grip on time, she sent Max downstairs and Ellie back to work. They'd both been smothering her all day, trying to offer a comfort that didn't exist. Frankly, it took all her strength, every bit she had, to stay here and not scream until she was hoarse. She couldn't let herself look at the people she loved, and who loved her. All of it just made her think of Alice. She stared out the bedroom window at the empty yard. Birds. Come spring, those birds would come looking for Alice. Behind her, the dogs chuffed softly to one another. They'd spent almost an hour looking for their girl. Now they were quiet, laying beside Alice's bed, waiting for her return. Every now and then, howls would fill the air. Julia glanced down at her watch and thought about how long they'd been gone. A few hours, and already it felt like a lifetime. It was 5:30. They would be nearing the city now. The majestic green of Alice's beloved forest would have given way to the gray of concrete. She would feel as alien there as any space traveler. Without her, the little girl would regress, retreat once more into her frightened and silent world. Her fear would be too big to handle. "Please, God," she whispered aloud, praying again for the first time in years, "take care of my girl. Don't let her hurt herself." She turned away from the window and saw the potted plants. Before Alice, those plants had been separate, placed as they'd been in various places throughout the house. Now they were the forest, the hiding place. She knew she should stay where she was, keep her distance, but she couldn't do it. She walked over to the plants, stroked their glossy green leaves. "You'll miss her too," she said throatily, not caring that she was talking to plants. It didn't matter now if she went a little crazy. She wasn't Dr. Cates now. She was just an ordinary woman missing an extraordinary girl. It was almost 6 now. They were probably on the floating bridge, crossing Lake Washington, nearing Mercer Island. Alice would see the snow-capped mountains in the distance and see where she'd come from. The air would smell different, too, of smog and cars and the tamed blue sound. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the clang and rattle of Max's cooking. She went to the table that was set for 2, pretending not to see the blank space where the 3rd placemat belonged. "What are you making?" she asked Max, who was in the kitchen chopping vegetables. At the sound of her voice, he looked up. Their gazes met. Stir-fry. He set down the knife and moved toward her. The phone keeps ringing. It's Ellie, he said. She wants to make sure you're okay. He put an arm around her and led her to the window. Together they stared out at the dark backyard. The first star of evening looked down on them. She leaned against him, loving the heat of his body against hers. It reminded her how cold she was. He didn't ask how she was or tell her it would be okay. He simply put his hand around the back of her neck, anchoring her. Without that touch, she might have drifted away, floated on this sea of emptiness. But with the one simple gesture, he'd reminded her that she hadn't lost everything, that she wasn't alone. I wonder how she's doing. Don't, he said softly. All you can do is wait. For what? Someday, when you think about her howling or eating the flowers or trying to play with spiders, you'll laugh instead of cry. Julia wanted to be helped by his words. As a psychiatrist, she knew he was right. The mother in her couldn't believe it. Behind them, the doorbell rang. To be honest, she was thankful for the distraction. "Did you lock Ellie out?" she asked, wiping her eyes and trying to smile. "I shouldn't have sent her to work anyway. I thought being with Cal would help." "Does it help?" Max asked. "Being with someone who loves you?" "As much as anything can." He nodded. Julia let go of him and went to the door, opening it. Alice stood there, looking impossibly small and frightened. She was twisting her hands together, the way she did when she was confused, and she had her shoes on the wrong feet. The sound she made was a strangled, confused howling. Seeping, bloody scratches lined her cheeks. George stood behind Alice. His handsome face was pale and seamed with worry lines she hadn't seen before. "She thinks you let her go because she was bad." It hit Julia like a blow to the heart. She dropped to her knees, looked Alice in the eyes. "Oh, honey, you're a good girl, the best." Alice started to cry in that desperate, quiet way of hers. Her whole body shook, but she didn't make a sound. "Use your words, Alice." The girl shook her head, howled in a keening, desperate wail. Julia touched her. "Use your words, baby. Please." The loss wrenched through Julia again, tore her heart. She couldn't go through this again. Neither one of them could. She knew that Alice wanted to throw herself at her, wanted a hug, but was afraid to move. All the little girl could think was that she was bad, that she would be abandoned again, just like before. And once more, she was afraid to talk. George climbed the creaking porch steps. Alice darted away from him, pressed her body against the side of the house. Her feet hit the metal dog bowls. The clanging sound rang through the chilly night air, then dissipated, leaving it quiet once more. George looked at Alice, then at Julia. "I tried to buy her dinner in Olympia. She went crazy, howling, growling. She scratched her face. Dr. Corell couldn't do shit to calm her down." "It's not your fault," Julia said softly. "All those years in prison, I dreamed she was still alive." Julia's heart went out to him. Slowly she stood. "I know." "I imagined finding her again. I thought she'd run into my arms and kiss me and tell me how much she missed me. I never realized she wouldn't know me." "She needs time to remember." "No, she's not my little girl anymore.
I guess you were right when you said she never was. When she was a baby, I was never home. She's Alice now.
Julia's breath caught. Hope flickered inside her, a tiny flame of light in the dark. She heard Max come up beside her. What do you mean? George stared down at his daughter. He looked older suddenly, a man lined by hard choices and harder living.
I'm not who she needs,
he said in a voice so quiet Julia almost missed it.
She's too much for me to handle. Loving her and parenting her are two different things. She belongs here with you.
Julia reached for Max's hand, clinging to it, but she looked at George. Are you sure?
Tell her, someday, that I loved her the only way I knew how, by letting her go. Tell her I'll be waiting for her. All she has to do is call.
You'll always be her father, George. He backed up, went down a step, then another.
They'll say I abandoned her,
he said softly. Julia gazed down at him, wishing she could tell him it wasn't true, but they both knew better than that. The media would judge him harshly for this. Your daughter will know the truth, George. I swear to you, she'll always know you love her.
I can't even kiss her goodbye.
Someday you'll be able to kiss her, George. I promise you.
Keep her close,
he said.
I made that mistake.
Julia's throat was so full of emotion she could only nod. If this were a Disney movie instead of real life, Alice would give her father a hug right now and say goodbye. Instead, she was huddled alongside the house, trying to disappear. Her cheeks were marred by scratches and streaked with blood and tears. George turned and walked away. In the driveway, he waved one last time before he got in his car and drove away. Julia knelt in front of Alice. Alice stood there, her little arms bolted to her sides, her hands curled into fists. Her mouth was trembling and tears washed her eyes, magnifying her fear. Julia's tears started again. There was no way to stop them, even though she was smiling now, too. Her emotions were almost too big to handle. Her whole body was trembling. Alice looked terrified. She watched George drive away, then turned to Julia. Alice, home? Julia nodded. Alice is home. Alice whispered, Julie, Mommy, and threw herself into Julia's waiting arms. They fell backward onto the hardwood floor, still locked together. Julia held Alice tightly, kissing her cheeks, her neck, her hair. Alice buried her face in the crook of Julia's neck. She felt the whispers of her breath as she said, Love, Julie, Mommy. Alice, stay. Yes, Julia said, laughing and crying. Alice, stay. Epilogue. As always, September was the best month of the year. Long, hot, sunny days melted into cold, crisp nights. All over town the grass was as thick as velvet and impossibly green. Scattered randomly throughout the towering evergreens were maple and alder trees dressed in their red and gold autumn finery. The swans had left Spirit Lake for the year, although the crows were everywhere, squatted on phone lines above every street, cawing and squawking at passers-by. At the corner of Olympic and Rainview, Julia stopped walking. Alice immediately followed suit, tucking in close, putting her hand in Julia's pocket. It was the first time in weeks she'd done it. Now, Alice, Julia said, looking down at her, we've talked all about this, There's nothing to be afraid of." Alice blinked up at her. Though she'd gained weight in the past 9 months and grown at least an inch, she still had a tiny heart-shaped face that sometimes seemed too small to hold those wide, expressive eyes. Today, wearing a pink corduroy skirt with matching cotton tights and a white sweater, she looked like any other girl on the first day of school. Only the careful observer would have noticed that she had too many missing teeth for a 5-and-a-half-year-old, and that sometimes she still called her mommy Julie.
Alice, not scared.
Julia led Alice to a nearby park bench and sat down beneath the protective umbrella of a huge maple tree. The leaves overhead were the color of ripe lemons. Every now and then one fluttered to the ground. Julia sat down, then pulled Alice onto her lap. "I think you are scared." Alice popped a thumb in her mouth for comfort, then slowly withdrew it. She was trying so hard to be a big girl. Her pink backpack, a recent present from George, fell to the ground beside her.
"They'll call Alice Wolf Girl,"
she said quietly. Julia touched her puffy, velvet-soft cheek. She wanted to say, "No, they won't." But she and Alice had come too far together to tell each other pretty lies. They might, mostly because they wish they knew a wolf.
"Maybe go school next year."
"You're ready now." Julia eased Alice off her lap. They stood up, holding hands. "Okay." A car pulled up on the street beside them. All 4 doors opened at once, and girls spilled out of the car, giggling and laughing. The older girls ran off ahead. Ellie, in uniform, looking deeply tired and profoundly beautiful, took Sarah's hand in hers and walked toward Julia. "Of course, you're on time," Ellie said. "You have 1 kid to get ready. Getting these 3 organized is like herding ants. And forget about Cal. His deadlines made him deaf." But as she said it, she laughed. "Or maybe it's me, always telling him to listen up." Sarah, dressed in blue jeans and a pink t-shirt, carrying a Shark Tales backpack, looked at Alice.
"You ready for school?" "Scared,"
Alice said. When she looked up at Julia, she added,
"I'm scared." "I was scared on the first day of kindergarten, too. But it was fun," Sarah said. "We had cake." "Really?" "You want to walk with me?" Sarah asked.
Alice looked up at Julia, who nodded encouragingly.
"Okay."
Alice mouthed,
"Stay close."
Julia nodded, smiling. The 2 girls came together, began walking toward the school. Ellie fell into step beside Julia. "Who'd have thought, huh? You and me walking our daughters to school together." "It's the start of a new family tradition. So how's the new bathroom coming?" "Cal ordered a jacuzzi tub," Ellie grinned. "It's big enough for 2. He's going to start on the addition next spring. 3 girls in our old bedroom is a nightmare. They fight every second." "Have you met your new neighbors?" "Yeah, a couple from California. They have 2 sons who already follow the girls around like lovesick puppies. I find it hilarious. Cal is not so amused. But I think he's glad Lisa made him sell the house. Too many memories. He always belonged in our house anyway." "Yeah," Ellie said, sounding like a woman head over heels in love. After 2 expensive weddings, complete with all the trimmings, she'd finally gotten lucky in a tiny chapel on the Vegas Strip. They crossed the street and climbed the steps to Rain Valley Elementary. All around them, women were holding on to their children's hands. Julia noticed the woman beside her, a beautiful redhead with bright, teary eyes. When she saw Julia look at her, the woman smiled. "It's my first time," she said, "walking Bobby to school. I hope I don't embarrass him by bursting into tears." "I know what you mean," Julia said. It was hard to let Alice go out in the world, but she had to do it. As they moved down the hallway, a bell rang. Kids and parents, scattered, disappeared into classrooms. Alice looked nervously at Julia.
Mommy?
I'll sit right out front all day, waiting for you. If you get nervous, all you have to do is look out the window, okay?
Okay.
She didn't sound okay. You want me to walk you in? Alice looked at Sarah, who was motioning for her to hurry, then back at Julia.
No. I'm a big girl,
she mouthed.
Come on, Alice, Sarah said. I'll show you to Miss Schmidt's room.
Following Sarah, Alice walked down the last bit of hallway to room 114. She gave Julia one last worried wave, then opened the door and went in. The door shut behind her. Julia let out her breath in a sigh. She wanted to smile and cry at the same time.
Yours can't stand to leave, and mine can't wait.
Yours didn't live through what Alice did. Maybe it is too early. Ellie looped an arm around Julia, drawing her close. She's going to be fine. Arm in arm, they walked out of the school and down the stairs and across the street to the park. There they sat down on the cold wooden bench and stared out at the town that had shaped their lives. The maple tree that had first welcomed Alice was a blaze of bright yellow leaves. "What are you going to do now that she's in school?" Ellie asked, leaning back. "Next year it'll be all day." Lately the question had arisen in Julia's mind, too. She'd had to ask herself who she was now, what she wanted. The answers had surprised her. For almost half of her life she'd been driven by her career. It had meant everything to her. Yet she'd lost it in a heartbeat. Perhaps she'd had some blame in that. She didn't know, would never know, if she could have changed Amber's future. But the blame wasn't what mattered. That was the lesson she'd learned. Life was impossibly fragile. If you were lucky enough to have a loving family, you had to hold on to them with infinite care. Never again would she be afraid of love. She turned to her sister. "Max asked me to marry him." Ellie shrieked. "It's about damn time!" She pulled Julia into her arms and held her tightly. "I thought I'd open an office here, too. Work part-time. There are kids who need me." Ellie drew back, wiping her eyes. "Mom and Dad would be so proud of you, Jules." That made Julia smile. "Yeah." She closed her eyes for just a moment, a breath, and remembered all of it. The woman she'd been less than a year ago, afraid of her own spirit and the danger of sharp emotions. The little girl named Alice she'd taken into her heart, and the man who dared to push past his own darkness toward the light they'd found deep in this old-growth forest. For years to come, she knew that the people of Rain Valley would talk about this special time, when a child unlike any other had walked out of the woods and into their lives and changed them all, and how it had begun in mid-October, when the trees were dressed in tangerine leaves and danced in the chilly, rain-scented breeze, and the sun was a brilliant shade of gold that illuminated everything. Magic Hour. For the rest of her life, she'd remember it as the time she finally came home. Acknowledgements. Several people were instrumental in the writing of this novel. Thanks go out to Lindsay Brooks, Investigative Manager, Case Management Department, Child Quest International; Luana S. Burnett, Police Services Officer, City of Newport, Washington; Kanie Levine, Criminal Defense Attorney and friend; and Kim Fisk and Megan Chance, who both helped more than they know.
We hope you have enjoyed our presentation of Magic Hour by Kristen Hanna, performed by Susan Torin, directed by Laura Grafton, engineered by Christopher Kessel. Performance copyright 2005 by Brilliance Publishing, Inc., all rights reserved. For further information concerning this program or other Brilliance audio titles, please visit our website at www.brilliancepublishing.com. No part of this recording may be played for an audience or reproduced in any form. It may not be streamed, downloaded, broadcast, or copied without written permission. Address all inquiries to Brilliance Audio, P.O. Box 887, Grand Haven, Michigan, 49417.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.